people are investing in a joke, and it's not like in the financial system have broken.
Don't John Day, do you?
Yeah, man, I agree. Do you reckon Elon Musk is Jewish?
John Day, do you think the Wavy sports better?
Nah.
What do you know today?
Nah.
Do you think Gary is paying?
Yeah, I do actually.
Fuck yeah, dude. I'm good.
You think Rabbi would know Jewish? What? You asked if everyone must be Jewish, and they asked, do you think Rabbi? Yeah, he would know, bro. He's like Israel's boss.
Thank you. I can tell you this. This is a very interesting question. I have heard it discussed at a Shabbat table, and it was not confirmed. So there were some people who said yes, who were from South Africa. There were other people from Brooklyn who said no. And this happened, and so it was not confirmed. There was no evidence that it was.
All right, do you agree?
I can tell you, though, he did attend a Jewish day school, so there's something to that. But
Can you invite me to Shabbat?
can I invite you to Shabbat? The next Shabbat that I have, potentially, yeah.
Rabbi, do the Goyim know?
Do I what?
Do the Goyim know?
Do other nations know about what?
About just do they know about I don't know. Do they just know?
I don't know what you're saying.
It's an open question.
Taking the Goyim in Shabbat.
Yeah, Rabbi, can I be Jewish?
Sure. If you want to be Jewish, talk to your local Orthodox rabbi.
As a Jew, what do you think of white people? He is white.
Many of us.
White and Jewish are different things.
Yeah. Here's what I can tell you. I want equality for all people globally someday. I'm not the person who makes those decisions. That's just how I feel in my heart. So any kind of words that are divisive, even Jew and non-Jew, I do my best to stay away from because I want to have a culture of inclusivity. When I'm talking to Jews, of course, there are some things that we can discuss, but when I'm talking to the general public, I do my best to be as open and honest as I can, but also as equal as I can. I want in the future all people to have rights across the board, no matter your background, black, white, Jew, non-Jew. I can tell you this, on the topic of race, just one moment, this is important too, and then you go to bed. On the topic of race, and maybe we even just at least close this topic on this, I use the quote from Morgan Freeman. If you want racism to go away, it will. You just need to stop talking about it.
Nice. So I get that invitation to Shabbat, right?
Rabbi, can you come to my bar mitzvah? Can you circumcise me, Rabbi?
I'm an anti-circumcision rabbi. I've had a bris, I've been circumcised, but I don't want it to continue. Yeah, I have it. I can show you my dick. You guys have seen my dick. You know where.
No. I've seen it. Rabbi.
Yep. Hey, guys. I've been hit with questions for 6 straight hours, and I'm going to take a little break from the questions.
I'm not asking questions. I'm saying if I'm able to come to Shabbat or not.
That's a question, and I answered it. That's exactly not what I said. If you would stop and get your fucking head out of your ass, you would hear me have said the next Shabbat that I have, there's the potential that I would invite you to. We can invite both Jews and non-Jews to Shabbat. But if you keep with that bullshit kind of attitude, fuck no. I don't want you anywhere near my Shabbats. My Shabbats are peaceful places. And I don't want your stressful your the stress that you would bring into my home, into my community with that. Now, if you can learn how to mature and ask correct questions and maybe be someone who I would be proud of in the community, then absolutely, I would have you with open arms. But you don't show that. If you showed some heartfeltedness to actually want to do this, then you would. But here's what you do. Hey, can you circumcise me? Hey, can you give me bar mitzvah? Hey, can you invite me to Shabbat? I've told you, if you want to be Jewish, what did I tell you?
I didn't see that. John Dick was saying.
Sorry, Rabbi. I'm sorry. I didn't even.
You're okay. What have I always told you guys? If you guys want to be Jewish, the easiest thing for you to do is contact your local Orthodox rabbi.
Okay.
That way,
Thank you.
you will be seen as a Jew as much as I'm a Jew, or as much as Benjamin Netanyahu is a Jew, or as much as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, was. You'll be as much of a Jew as any of us are. But that can be done, and that can be done. So don't think that it can be done. But if you're like, hey, I just want to be able to think that I'm cool, well, I can tell you that you're just not going to get accepted to the program if that's why you're doing it. There are programs in order
They
to...
can
Very well. That's a mature way to handle it. And if you really are interested, Chinese merchant, I can tell you that if you have interest and you act with maturity, the second that I go viral and after all of the hoopla is done and I can open up my home for a real Shabbat, absolutely, we'll have you there. And we'll have you talk about it.
Wait, just one question.
Go ahead.
What's the Shabbat there?
It's a Sabbath. It's essentially Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown, and what?
It's like a party.
Yeah, what Chinese merchant is referencing is a dinner he'd like to be invited to.
Yes.
All right.
Also, you know,
You want to go to Hanukkah?
yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you this. We'll have a huge Hanukkah party, and yeah, that one. I'm serious. You can take place, and you could take part in all of these things, but you have to do it with a sincere heart. You just can't be like, hey, like you literally come in here drunk and high sometimes, or maybe just high, not drunk. Sorry, but you come in here and you just be like, I want to convert to Judaism, and then you leave, and then it's like, dog, I can tell you're not taking it seriously. If you're taking it seriously, I'll give you more leeway. But if you're just coming in here asking questions if I don't see the sincerity behind it, you have to understand. You have to understand that perhaps my friends will be there, perhaps my family will be there, and they're gonna okay. So Chinese merchants here. What's good about Chinese merchant? I'm like, well, he just asked to be here, and they'll say to me, okay, so this is the best person that you could find. And I'm gonna say no. He's just somebody I found. That's not who I bring to my Shabbat. Shabbat people are only the best of society. That's the only people who get invited. So be the best of society in all aspects, and you'll have many, many opportunities to attend.
So, would you bring Aiden Ross to your Shabbat?
Absolutely, 100%.
I'll go to Shabbat if I can offer that.
Excellent. All right, guys, we're going to listen to Haskalah. This is the Jewish Enlightenment. Enjoy.
They would be trained in military values and also trained in Russian Orthodox Christianity. And many times they would simply never return to their families. They would end up, assimilating into the Russian society. Very, very terrible thing. The alternative that Nicholas I offered was Jews could attend the so-called crown schools, which were Russian-approved schools that had some participation of Jewish leaders like Max Lilienthal, who believed that perhaps this is a way that the Haskalah could offer, enlightenment to Russian Jewish populations, but in reality, they ended up being fronts for conversionist efforts. And even Lilienthal left in disgust. He ended up here in the United States. So it was in this context that the fight of the Hasidim and the Misnagdim had to be viewed. But I think one of the most fascinating figures reflecting on this in the 19th century is Eliezer Tzweifel, who wrote an interesting book called Shalom al Yisrael, Peace Upon Israel, in which he wrote the following. God saw three shepherds, Rabbi Eliyahu in Lithuania, that of course would be the Vilna Gaon, the leaders of the Misnagdim, to safeguard the Torah, to purify its Talmud, and to oversee its logic and its diligent study. That's like shepherd number one. Shepherd number two, the Hasidim in Volhynia, to marshal devotion and to fan the embers of feeling, right? The Hasidim with their ideals of devekut and closeness to God and so on. And finally, the great sage of our people, Moses ben Menachem in Germany, that's Moses Mendelssohn, the leader of the Misnagdim, who of course was himself observant, as we mentioned earlier, and called him to place the cradle of enlightenment in the lamp of religion. Now, of course, not everyone would agree with the views of Rabbi Tzweifel that, all three of these shepherds, the leader of the Misnagdim, the leader of the Hasidim, and the leader of the Maskilim, that they all somehow are like appointed by God to lead the Jews into the future. So I'm going to leave that to you to debate. But it is worthy of note that today, couple of centuries later, all three of these movements, the Hasidim, the Misnagdim, and the Maskilim, continue to exert tremendous influence on the development of Jewish identity and continue to exist with each other in kind of a dynamic tension to tease out what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. Whew, okay, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I had fun thinking about it and talking about it with you.
John, I'm glad you're here.
If you are so inclined, please do subscribe. Please share this video with other people who you think would like it, because one of my increasing pleasures with putting these lectures out there is seeing other people hit that subscribe button and increase the universe of people who are interested in studying Jewish history with me. Thank you very much for watching.
Yeah, 24/7. All day, every day. I'm always live.
Like shopping and stuff.
What do you mean shopping?
Like we have to go out and shop and do things to just keep the cameras on.
Oh yeah. So I do IRL, but I get a lot of my stuff just shipped to me since it's easier. But yeah, I've streamed as far north as Santa Barbara, as far south as San Diego, as far west as the ocean, Santa Monica, as far east as the mountains and the desert. And I have streamed in Beverly Hills. I've streamed at Disneyland. So I have a lot of IRL footage. Just basically nobody watches it because it's just I have so much footage. Period. But yeah, it's on Instagram, and whenever I need something, I do my best to do it all on camera. It's essentially a real life Big Brother. You can watch me whenever you want.
So I go into New York Times, why is the profile picture something that's not nice?
Well, what is it?
On the south side.
Okay, let's see here. It says the account might include sensitive content. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the settings that you have on. So let's take a look at it. I'm not exactly sure. I don't log into this account often, but I want to know just as much as you do. So we'll find out. It's nothing wrong. They're just saying that. They're saying that it is. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. We're going to find out together. That's the thing. If I don't know, I want to find out just as much as you do. Southside Pimp. Is it 001? Let me see. Southside pin 00. Just 2 zeros? Okay. Password. Boost your account security. Get started. Nobody cares about that. Okay, what is going on in my account? What is my profile picture? I think that's my one right here on my arm. Like underneath my arm right here. I have another picture that I just posted to Reddit here of the, it's a similar picture. Just 1 moment. It is, dun, 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 dun. I think it's from a series that I did not recent, that's a long time ago, but here. So this is a bigger version of it, but I think it's just with my arm raised and inside like this. Okay, well, that's your opinion. Nobody said that it had to be the coolest thing in the world. It's a picture. Okay. Oh, apologies. I misheard you. I apologize, Z. I thought you said that's nasty. I was like, okay, well, what do you want me to do? Yeah, no, I understand. But yeah. As for the content, though, let's see why it got banned or why it's saying that. So it could, I don't know. I mean, it's just a bunch of pictures. It's just a bunch of videos of me. Just see. That are just from the same angle. So I don't know why they consider this to be sensitive information. Any other questions? That's a good one. I didn't recognize that.
So when it comes to your server, how old it has to be?
Oh, you have to be 18. Are you 18?
How old are you playing?
How old are you?
2 years younger.
Okay, so I can't have you in here. It says that you got to be 18 to be in here. Take care, Z.
So you need to be 18 before.
Yeah, it says that. When you come in, it says you must be 18 years old to be in here.
That's cool, right?
Exactly.
Send me a message on Telegram.
Excellent. I'll take a look when I can, my man.
I actually do, yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
Hello and welcome to Jewish History Lab. Today I'd like to look
Pardon
at
me?
the emancipation of the Jews in Western and East Central Europe. In many ways, this particular period, which begins at the end of the 18th century and extends into the 19th century, represents really the coming together of a lot of pre-modern impulses and results in the ultimate political emancipation of the Jews, or the granting of equal rights to Jews throughout Western Europe. As we shall see, the legal emancipation of the Jews is not quite the same thing as the social emancipation of the Jews, but nevertheless, it's a fascinating story, and in many ways it represents the beginning of modernity as we understand it today. Now, it's really important for us to just take a second to think about what does this word emancipation actually mean. It's a word that Jewish historiography has seized upon, although it clearly is borrowed from the experience of African Americans and a much more dramatic emancipation that occurred with the context of the American Civil War in the 1860s. There's a huge contrast. In many ways, it's really not a fair word to use, but that is the accepted term, so we'll go with it. The Jews prior to their emancipation were not slaves. It's not the same thing as the African Americans experience. They were largely, living with a series of disabilities residence restrictions, the hated Jewish oath, and so on. They were not directly enslaved to owners. They had a certain degree of freedom of movement. They had a limited degree of freedom to choose different occupations, very isolated and narrow opportunities for higher education, but it's not at all comparable to being a slave on a plantation. But nevertheless, we use this term to try to find a word to express the release of all of these disabilities in the late 18th and 19th century. So by way of background, it's very important for us to understand that, you know, if we're using this term emancipation, what do we exactly mean by it? So before the modern era, Jews lived in a corporate structure, which is a little bit like feudalism, meaning everybody in society lives in a certain box that is related primarily to their role in the overall economy. You have this massive box that is primarily populated by serfs who have the least amount of rights. They are kind of attached to the land, and although they are also not enslaved, they are nevertheless highly dependent on the nobility for their rights of movement, even their rights of marriage and things like that. But they nevertheless have kind of like day-to-day freedom that makes them very unslave-like. The Jews were not in that box. The Jews were also not in the box of the nobility or the knights and groups of people like that who engage in various activities that are specifically, you know, related to their high status in society, managing large, farms and manors and things like that. The Jews were closest to the burghers or the sort of incipient middle class who were dealing with various types of commerce because Jews were heavily urbanized. But even in urban centers, they were frequently denied formal burgher status. They were typically denied access to a whole range of professional guilds and things like that. And so they weren't really in the burgher class or burgher status, even though they tended to, in their lifestyle, be closest to them. They obviously were not in the clergy, which was another box in the kind of feudal design of medieval society. So what exactly were they? Well, as we've discussed in previous lectures, they were essentially servi camerae regis. They were servants of the royal chamber. They had burgher-like activities, also middleman activities, primarily in tax farming and leaseholding and so on, and obviously very active in money lending. And a lot of the cash that their activities produced was directly taxed by the king, in exchange for which the Jews had the protection of the royal chamber, the protection of the king, and that's basically how they managed to exist in medieval Europe. But with modernity, a lot of things changed because it was no longer possible to keep people in these boxes. Serfs were being emancipated all over Europe. The last region to emancipate their serfs was the Russian Empire. They were also the last to emancipate the Jews as well, some 50 odd years later. And people were like moving into cities. Industrialization was happening, and people were like moving into factory jobs, which really upended a lot of the structures of rural agrarian life. But it was like a period of transition where you might have people who would go back to the ancestral farms and essentially do serf-like activity during the harvest season, and then they would go into the cities during the winter and work like blue-collar jobs in these burgeoning factories. So it was a very kind of transitional period in the 18th century and 19th century. The Jews, for their part, were really pressing to get more rights of residence, to move wherever they wanted, to be free from the hated Mora Judaico, this kind of medieval oath where, because Jews were considered intrinsically untrustworthy, they had to endure ritual humiliations when they were making an oath in court. Like they had to stand on a pigskin, sometimes with their chest bared, holding on to a sacred Torah and so on. So they wanted to get rid of a lot of these things. They wanted access to higher education. They wanted access to, generally everything that was going on in culture and science and society in the modern era. And the emancipation movement was something that slowly, in fits and starts, granted these things to Jews. Obviously, it was very closely related to the Haskalah that we discussed in a previous video, the Jewish Enlightenment, because while the Jewish Enlightenment was primarily an intellectual movement that was about changing the way Jews thought and bringing it more into line with the intellectual currents of contemporary European culture, it was also a political movement. It was saying that, if Jews can be reformed in terms of their use of the vernacular, in terms of their relationship to society, and understanding their civic responsibilities, then society should in turn give them the legal rights of citizens. Let us not forget that for much of medieval history, Jews were considered formally travelers. They were like resident aliens. They were not considered like normally subjects of the king like everybody else was. And in modernity, this is a time when kings in general were in decline, and the idea of societies being made up of equal citizens, particularly white males, that's something that was coming of age, and the Jews were claiming their rights to be there as well. So let's look for a moment now at the United States, which was technically the first modern country to formally emancipate the Jews. And it was not the hardest thing in the world for the United States to do. This is because the Jews did not constitute the major challenge to emancipation. Obviously, African-American slaves were the big challenge. America is very much a society that is still trying to come to terms with the racial character of its history. And the Jews were nearly, but not quite white. This is not the place in this class to talk about the gradual whitening of the Jews, but one of the things that is largely true of American society is that Jews were generally considered like not quite white like Northern Europeans were. And by the way, this is not only Jews, this is also Irish and Italian people and so on. Up until really the 20th century, these peoples were considered kind of like off-white in the skin tones of social structure in 18th century America, and in 19th century as well, they were not quite in the same degree of whiteness. Obviously, this speaks to the fact that whiteness is largely a social construct. Obviously, there are skin tones that we can discern visually, but especially when you get in the kind of the middle range, it really depends a lot on how a person behaves, how a person carries himself, how a person is viewed by society around them, that determines whether or not a person is actually white or actually not white. So Jews were, for the most part, nearly white. And more significantly, they were not Catholic. There was a tremendous antipathy towards Catholics, regardless of their skin color. It happened to coincide, of course, with the Irish and with the Italians, who are also generally Catholic. So there's a lot of hesitation to giving rights to, first of all, African Americans. That, of course, America fought a war over that, but also these nearly white peoples like the Irish Catholics, the Italian Catholics, and then, of course, the Jews. So viewed from the perspective of those who wanted to limit the full access to society in early America, the Jews were like a lower priority for their exclusion. And the kinds of disabilities that Jews faced in the 18th and 19th century America were comparatively minimal. There's questions about whether or not they could hold public office, some issues of whether or not their oaths would be trusted because they would not take them on Christian Bibles, for example, and those were fairly easily dealt with. The Constitution of 1787 and especially the Bill of Rights of 1791 clearly indicated that Jews should be free of these disabilities, although vestigial oath laws did persist in some states until 1877, when the last one was removed. That was applying specifically to New Hampshire. So in other words, the United States of America, very small Jewish population, nearly white. It was not really that difficult to actually make that big step and emancipate them. In England, you have a fascinating phenomenon where social change precipitated legal change, where it seemed like English voting society in particular were ready for the idea of the emancipation of Jews before they were actually emancipated. I think one of the great examples of this is David Solomon, shown here, who was actually elected Sheriff of London in 1835, but could not immediately hold office because of that hated Jewish oath, that he would not take the oath that indicated that he was a Christian, which of course he was not. So in other words, we have this situation where, and this happened, by the way, to many elected officials in England until the whole process was eventually solved, where the population as a whole, the voting eligible population, thought that the Jewish candidate was the superior candidate for a position, and they voted him into office. It's always a him. And it was the office itself that was trying to hold back on allowing this Jewish candidate until eventually, after significant debates in English governmental circles, they abolished the Jewish oath. So emancipation for Jews in England actually came from a groundswell of support, at least among the voting population. France has an entirely different story. Here you see a depiction of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and, in brackets, male citizen. This is, of course, a hugely important document that's roughly comparable to the American Bill of Rights, in which, it decrees the kind of ideas of equality for all citizens, things like that. It's interesting to note, by the way, that there are limitations even to these very beautiful documents. In the case of the United States of America, the declaration that all men are created equal was not interpreted to mean really all men, because it did not include African Americans, for example. And this Declaration for the Rights of Man and Citizen, a revolutionary figure named Marie Gouze actually said, hey, wait a second, why does it have to be in the masculine? And so she composed a Declaration for the Rights of Woman and Citizen. And the word citizen, of course, in French can be declined either as a male or as a female, but the French government at the time was not willing to accept that. They were really only thinking about men. Honestly, it says man and they meant man, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion today. In the case of France, unlike England, where social change precipitated legal change, in France, it was legal change that precipitated social change, almost. In other words, the laws were put on the books before society was totally ready for them. So what happened in France is you have the revolution in 1789, and then almost immediately, Jews start saying, hey, what about us? We're included too, right? We're also part of this revolution. And philosophically, it was really hard to say no, because so much of the grounding of the French Revolution, like the American Revolution, was based on this flowery and soaring rhetoric of the equality of all people and so on. So that includes Jews too, right? So there was a big distinction between the smaller, much more acculturated Sephardic population of Jews that lived in the west and south of France, in Bordeaux and Bayonne, and the much more highly dense and concentrated and less acculturated Jews living on the eastern border in the region of Alsace-Lorraine, the Ashkenazi Jews. The Sephardi Jews largely spoke French, largely had a much more French lifestyle in terms of their dress and their broader, economic profile and things like that. But the Jews in Alsace, on the other hand, spoke Yiddish as their first tongue, were much more sort of Germanotropic in their cultures, tends to be far more observant of Jewish law, both at home and more significantly in the street. And so what happened in France is, in 1790, the emancipation was extended to the Sephardic Jews in Bordeaux and Bayonne. It was much easier to accept them. And after a certain amount of hemming and hawing, in 1791, the same was granted to the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine. Now, that wasn't the end of the story by any means. There was a significant outcry because with emancipation, all of the restrictions on Jewish economic activity were lifted, and Jews were allowed to engage in, whatever kind of occupation they wanted. And they rushed to all kinds of occupations where they had, a significant advantage because they were overwhelmingly literate, numerate, They were well connected with Jews living in other countries, so import, export, all kinds of commerce and so on. And large populations of Christians in Alsace began to complain that, hey, our entire business environment is changing as a result of these Jews rushing into fields and, undercutting us with prices and all kinds of things. And so a lot of complaints went to the Emperor Napoleon, who, in his typically grand kind of way of thinking about things, said, well, obviously we've got to talk to these Jews. So do they have like a representative body or something like that? Do they have a pope like we do, Catholics? And so his advisors told him, well, they have this thing called the Sanhedrin, which was the ancient court of 71 judges back in the ancient period. But they haven't met in 1900 years since they were exiled from Israel. Actually, not quite since they were exiled, but shortly thereafter. And so he said, fine, I'm Napoleon, let's reopen the Sanhedrin. And so messages were sent out all over Europe that Napoleon was going to gather the Sanhedrin. And in that gathering, he was going to ask them a series of 12 questions. This was actually the Assembly of Jewish Notables that was prior to the convening of the formal Sanhedrin. The questions that he asked were actually quite fascinating, and they really give us an insight as to, what he wanted from the Jews. He asked questions like, for example, do the Jews have their own police force? What's the point of asking about the police force? Well, the point is because he wanted to know if he was going to be accepting a state within a state. It doesn't make sense for there to be two judiciaries and two police enforcement agencies. What if, Jews wanted to run their affairs through a French law, all kinds of things like this. He wanted to know a little bit about the assimilationability, is that a word? The assimilability of the Jew. He asked, for example, are Jews allowed to marry non-Jews? Now, in basic Jewish law, that's like a really short answer. No, intermarriage is not permitted under Jewish law. Obviously, there are interfaith relationships, but that's really more of a 20th and 21st century phenomenon, and certainly not countenanced by traditional Jewish law, although some of the denominations that are active today, of course, have different relationship to that question. But in the 18th century, the answer was no, it's not allowed. It's fascinating to note that the Assembly of Notables and the later Sanhedrin, which were made up largely of maskilim, there was only a very small number of Jews who represented the traditional viewpoint, what we would call today Orthodox, and they essentially hemmed and hawed on this answer. And they said, well, not exactly, wouldn't it precisely be recognized, but, and they knew what kind of answers Napoleon wanted, and they provided him with that. I think the most dramatic moment in the Sanhedrins, or the Assembly of Notables gathering, was when he asked them, would the Jews defend France? Do they consider themselves French, or would they join with their enemies? Now, the fact is that France and Germany are having wars just about once every 30 or 40 years, which means that, God forbid, we're pretty much due for one right now. Let's hope that we put that behind us. But, he was really concerned about those Jews living in Alsace who were, Yiddish speaking. Yiddish is a much closer language to German than it is to French, and that they had all kinds of contacts with Jews on the German side of the border. What would happen if France and Germany got into a war? Who would French Jews fight for? And dramatically, the assembly rose up and said, jusqu'à la mort. They would defend France to the very death. That was the whole idea of it. So Napoleon was satisfied with those answers, and he said, great. So the Sanhedrin became a formal institution, and it was headed by this man, David Zinsheim, who has an absolutely amazing hat here. I mean, I want a hat like that. I think that would be fantastic. He was actually a renowned Torah scholar of the day. He wrote a significant commentary on the Mishnah called Yad David, still studied to this day. And he was one of the more orthodox members of the Sanhedrin that gave it kind of like its weight on the right wing of the Jewish spectrum. There's a lot more to say about how Napoleon directed the organization of Jewish synagogues within France, but I'm going to leave it at this point because I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about East Central Europe. So in Austria, a document was issued by Kaiser Joseph II called the Toleranzpatent in 1782. This was kind of like a very important pre-emancipation document that sort of gave the Jews of Austria a formal understanding of what their rights were within Austria. And that's very important because, rights as opposed to concessions is an extremely important notion and a great stepping stone towards full emancipation. But what happened over the next 100-odd years was really quite distressing and confusing. Austria, like much of East Central Europe, went through a revolution in 1848-49, and that revolution was then pushed back. And the revolution came from the more liberal side of the spectrum. So with the general constitution that was created in 1849, civil and political rights were issued for everyone in Austria, and quote unquote not dependent on religion. But then in 1851, when there was kind of like a conservative backlash to that revolution, those rights were taken back. The constitution was abrogated. And then slowly it was reinstated again over the 1860s. The same kind of thing was happening in Hungary, although you also had very significant opposition to emancipation from Jews themselves in Hungary, led by the Chassam Sofer, a very important Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who essentially said that, emancipation is going to result in assimilation. He was not at all wrong. Emancipation and assimilation seem to go hand in hand. And he said we should not accept emancipation. We should demand to have unequal rights because that's really a very important tool that the Jews used to maintain group integrity. Nevertheless, this was the zeitgeist, the trend of the times, and with the formal uniting of Austria and Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then there was formal emancipation granted to the Jews as well. This is also a period of tremendous social change in urban areas, in particular in Budapest. Hopefully we'll come back to that a little later. Finally, in Germany, this region had the most extensive, prolonged struggle between liberal and conservative elements, specifically with regard to the Jews. So emancipation in Germany over the 19th century, which was, by the way, not united for most of the 19th century, it was very piecemeal, it was very limited. Rights given to Jews were frequently extended in a very grudging manner, and there's a tremendous amount of social hesitancy. So like in great contrast to England, where social change demonstrated the readiness for emancipation well before it was actually granted, in Germany you had a situation where there was definitely very little social readiness for emancipation. There were some, bright lights here and there, like Christian Wilhelm von Dohm, who wrote very important work advocating for the emancipation of Jews. But by and large, German society as a whole was just not ready for emancipation. But a far more representative figure would be someone like this man, Heinrich von Treitschke, a very significant historian who entered into a very heavy debate with Heinrich Gretz over the publication of the latter's History of the Jews. Von Treitschke coined the unfortunate phrase, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, and he articulated a position that would later be picked up very enthusiastically by none other than Adolf Hitler, and he argued that the emancipation of the Jews had to be rolled back, and of course the disaster of the Holocaust ensued. So that's a very quick look at the emancipation of Jews in Western and East Central Europe. In the next video, I'd like to look at Eastern Europe, which had a very different trajectory. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. We have a great learning community that is always expanding, bringing in lots of people who want to study Jewish history. And okay, I guess that's about it. Thank you very much for watching. Hello and welcome to another episode of Jewish History Lab. Today I'd like to spend some time talking about the birth of modern Jewish politics, which is really a phenomenon that we see appearing in the late 19th century. Now, obviously, that seems ridiculously late in the sense that, as long as there have been more than one Jew, there have been politics, right? It's just part of the nature of the Jewish experience, I think, and possibly of the human experience in general. But what I'm going to be focusing in on in this context is the idea of the birth of mass movements with political ideologies that are adopted by Jews, particularly in the modern era, especially because this is a time when democracy begins to make its impact on the Jewish community, and in particular, the great mass of population that resides in Eastern Europe, where there's so many more Jews to create that critical mass to move political agendas along. And prior to the 1880s, by and large, Jews were quiescent when it came to political activity. They largely trusted their leadership to have any kind of interface with the secular authorities. And so really it was a matter of more kind of like feudal relationships where the Stadlan, the intercessor that would be hired by the head of the Kehillah, would be the one that would be interacting with the nobleman or the king or whatever on behalf of the entire community. And the idea of a group of Jews breaking away from the central authorities was really quite unusual and doesn't have a long tradition before the modern era. In the modern era, however, for a variety of reasons, Jews began to look at more, contemporary ways of organizing themselves and not necessarily in conformity with the will of the rabbinic and communal leadership. And that's where we get these modern Jewish politics. So let's have a look at that specifically. I think we can date the major important turning point in the development of modern Jewish politics to 1881. That is the date upon which Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, shown here with his son and with his wife. He was a very popular Tsar in Eastern Europe. He was the great Tsar liberator because it was on his watch that the serfs were liberated. It was definitely not a complete solution like the emancipation of Africans in America. It was not a funded emancipation, like they went from one set of difficulties to another set of difficulties, but nevertheless, the Russian populace as a whole tended to regard him favorably. The ones who did not, in particular, were the revolutionaries, the early socialist movements that were burgeoning in the 1870s. And in 1881, a group of them, organized under the name Narodnya Volya, the People's Will, tossed a bomb at his carriage and killed him, as you can see in these contemporary newspaper accounts of that act of violence. The rumor went out throughout the empire that the new emperor, the son, Alexander III, gave the populace permission to beat the Jews for 3 days. Now, for a long time, Jewish historiography basically took this at some kind of face value. And if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, there's a famous scene where Tevye is approached by a policeman who wants to give him some kind of heads up that a pogrom is coming. But it seems like this is not an accurate depiction of what happened in Russia. In reality, the pogroms went way out of control. The Russian Empire and the government was certainly not the architects of the violence. They had a great difficulty trying to control them. The entire administration, the police force, was exposed as being, inept, excessively bureaucratic, too slow to respond to this rapid movement of violence that essentially followed the newly laid rail lines that were connecting many communities. And the pogroms went on not for 3 days, but for 3 years, till 1884. And it really underscored the fact that Russia was no longer capable of maintaining itself as a Rechtsstaat, that is, a country governed by law. There was simply too much anarchy possible, too much chaos possible, and that is really something that the Jews as a minority fear tremendously. So it is the violence that erupted in 1881 and extended for a few years that really triggered the rethinking by Jews of their political status, or ethnic populations that were minorities in a particular region, like Poles in Ukrainian territory and vice versa, things like that. And it was something that really just got way out of hand for the Russians. Now, this map and the few charts that I'd like to show you right now come from a really interesting article. It was published in 2019 by Irena Grosfeld, Sehun Sorkan-Sakali, and Ekaterina Zhuravskaya that point out something that really should be fairly obvious, but no one else, to my knowledge, has really made these correlations. The pogroms, why did they happen? So there's definitely a certain amount of latent anti-Semitism in traditional society, and we can tie it to, certain church teachings and certain economic practices of the Jews, and, the long-term resentment that goes back to the Khmelnytsky rebellion, the Haidamach rebellion, and so on. But Jews basically lived in relative peace alongside their Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Russian neighbors, with only a few significant punctuations of violence, like under Khmelnytsky in the 17th century and under Honta in the 18th century. So the majority of Jewish history in the Pale Settlement was relatively peaceful, not necessarily loving, but one of coexistence. So why all these pogroms all of a sudden? So have a look at these charts. Let me just move over to the other side of the screen here. So this is a chart that shows the number of pogroms in the years 1800 to 1928. And I'm a little bit suspicious of the last number because I always thought there was a much bigger surge in 1919, but let's take it at face value for now because the conclusions are going to be really useful. Here is the number of pogroms correlated with years of crop failure. And as you can see, yes, pogroms do correlate with certain periods of crop failure, but by no means all periods of crop failure. There are some periods when, terrible crop situation, especially from before 1881, that do not result in anti-Jewish violence. And in fact, there's a rather extended period before the Russian Revolution in 1917 where there's no violence to speak of. So what's going on there? Then if you look at a different kind of factor, political turmoil, the same kind of thing holds. Yes, those periods of violence against Jews in 1881 and in 1904-05, of course, the Kishinev pogrom and the Civil War pogroms, they coincided with significant political upheaval, but lots of periods where you had political upheaval and no violence against Jews. So what's going on? So what the authors of this study did, which was very clever, is they put together both of those variables with violence against Jews, and this is the money chart right here. Wow, look at this. The purple lines demonstrate that when there is a combination of political turmoil and crop failure, that is a disastrous time for anti-Jewish violence. Meaning those two factors joined together have a direct correlation with violence against Jews. And I think this says a lot about the fundamental working pieces that motivate people to attack their neighbors in this circumstance. Okay, let's go to the political thing. So under these circumstances, right, you've got 3 years of chaos in the former Russian Empire, and Jews are basically saying, nothing's working here. We've been relying on our traditional leadership for a long time. We're very disappointed with how they handled, among other things, the Kantonisten crisis that we discussed in a previous video. We have to do something different. And so basically Jews decided en masse that they were going to use 5 distinct strategies to meet the moment. Here they are. The first is actually the most traditional of all. That is emigration, right? That historically, when conditions are growing increasingly poor for Jews in a particular region, and they see no easy way to change it, so they pick up and they move somewhere else. This is a 2,000-year-old tested strategy that has worked fairly well. And so you can see from this map, which we've looked at in other contexts, a large outpouring of Jews from the Pale of Settlement to America, to Canada, the United States of America, to Canada, to South America, 250,000 to Western Europe, significant numbers of Jews to the land of Israel and to South Africa, and a small number going all the way out to Australia. This most traditional strategy ultimately doesn't solve the problem. It just hopes that it will be better somewhere else, and it could in fact become worse, as we shall see as we move into the 20th century in Western Europe in particular. The second major strategy says, no, we're not going to leave this country. We're going to change this country. And that is this refers to the widespread adoption of socialist ideas by many Jewish youth, in particular during this time. Here's a mugshot of Leon Trotsky, one of the most important Jewish socialist leaders of the period. He was the mastermind behind the 1905 Wildcat strike that ultimately forced the Russian government to change its way of operation. And what it's called the 1905 revolution. It really wasn't a revolution because the Tsar was still in power, but he had to cede more authority to a revised parliament. What is not as well known about Trotsky's personal problems with the Russian Empire is that in 1905 it was virtually impossible to get a decent haircut anywhere in the Russian Empire. So anyways, Jewish socialism. This was something that was antithetical to traditional Jewish values, primarily because socialism, following the ideas of Karl Marx, who was himself born Jewish and baptized as a child by his parents, was rather anti-Semitic himself, a self-hating Jew, and he had lots of terrible things to say about religion in particular, and Jews as well. So the socialists tend to have a very anti-religious, anti-clerical position, and so it did not represent the mass of the Jewish population, but there was definitely a segment of the younger population who felt like socialism, although it represented a radical break from Jewish culture and thought and so on, nevertheless represented the way forward for a more enlightened society. We'll continue with this, God willing, in the next video. Thirdly, rather than saying, let's emigrate and hope it gets better someplace else, rather than saying, let's not emigrate, let's try and change the country here, the third strategy is Zionism, saying, let's emigrate, but we'll emigrate for the last time. We'll emigrate back to our national homeland in the land of Israel, and we will there reestablish a Jewish polity, a Jewish state, a Jewish army, a Jewish flag, Jewish passports, and so on. And this will be representative of some kind of secular messianic ideal where it will represent the end of time, because Jews will no longer wander from one place to another. Here is an image of the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, with a large picture of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism in the background, proclaiming the independence of Israel in 1948. So this was also a very, very popular option that many young Jews in particular gravitated to, even though, like socialism, most of the traditional rabbinate and leadership opposed it, saying that it was kind of like a chutzpah, an act of insolence towards God, in the sense that returning to Israel is part of the messianic future. And by, forcing God's hand, by moving to Israel and is trying to establish a state before the Messiah arrived, that was considered, almost heretical to some rabbis. And therefore, this also represented a break from tradition. The fourth option was the least popular, but nevertheless had a significant impact ideologically. This is the notion of diaspora nationalism that said essentially, okay, we're not going to leave, no immigration. We're not going to change this society to become socialist. That's such a radical change. We're not going to do that. We are also not going to move to Israel, which actually, according to diaspora nationalists, sort of represented a step backwards in terms of the evolution of the Jewish people, because as the founding ideologue of diaspora nationalism argued, the Jews had sort of advanced beyond the stage of needing a political state to constitute their own identity. That Jews were capable of perpetuating their culture and thought as a minority scattered throughout the world. So to go and say, oh, we want to create a state somewhere, whether it's in Israel or Uganda or anywhere, that represents, looking backwards for the diaspora nationalists. And where they had a limited amount of impact in Eastern Europe, their ideas were actually implemented very briefly in Ukraine, and then for slightly longer periods in the interwar states of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Everything came to a crashing halt with World War II. A version of diaspora nationalism, however, survives in the institution of the Jewish Federation, which is kind of like this loose agglomeration of Jewish groups around the country to collectively raise money for charity, to represent Jewish interests before democratic governments, and so on. The huge difference between the way the diaspora nationalists envision their thought of how to deal with modernity and the way the Jewish Federation works is that the Jewish Federation is entirely voluntary, meaning a person can choose to identify as a Jew, affiliate with the community, or not. That's, modernity doesn't really demand that you have to fit into a particular box. The diaspora nationalists had a vision where Jews would actually be in a fixed group. They would pay a certain amount of communal taxes to their own leadership. They would have the rights as a group to draw on state resources for communal practices. They would have a certain amount of protection in terms of, not having elections on Shabbat and things like that. But it was a much more kind of like well-structured organization than the Jewish Federation, which is essentially a volunteer organization. However powerful and effective it is, it ultimately depends on people wanting to belong to it, which was not the case with diaspora nationalists. And finally, the last national strategy to deal with the evolution of Jewish life in a modern democratic area are the so-called by me anyways, renewed traditionalists. These are Jews who really are still, in many ways, thinking to the pre-modern era of traditional Torah leadership, definitely very much an Orthodox kind of way of thinking. And they're saying, wait a minute, why are Jews organizing politically? We should be investing much more energy in our religious activities. We should be focusing on things we need as religious Jews. However, given the rapid advance of democratizing movements in Europe and the promise of a democratic Russian empire, which turned out, not to work out that way, but at least not in the 20th century, at least not the beginning of the 20th century. We'll talk about that later as well, God willing. They said, you know what? If we don't organize politically like these other non-religious movements, then we will lose an opportunity to express the voice of religious Jewry, which represents a very large proportion over the overall Jewish public. And so the renewed traditionalists, with parties like Agudas Yisrael, Agudas Achim, and several other groups, they essentially tried to promote a religious agenda, that really demanded things specifically for religious observance within this new democratic or proto-democratic environment. Okay, those are the 5 basic strategies that Jews chose from. There are lots of shadings in between them. Let's just have a look at what they look like on a political spectrum. And essentially, I'm going to be reviewing the material in the last group of slides, but we will be putting it in a graphic format so it's a little bit easier to understand. So here you go. Here's a typical political spectrum, the way we would study it in American political science or things like that. You have a line, and on the left you have socialism, and on the right you have capitalism, right? If you think about American politics, at least until recent years, you could say that Democrats would be just slightly left of center, Republicans would be just slightly right of center, but basically they're really close to the middle. Jewish politics are not like that. You can have really wide ranges of extremes between them. But Jewish politics is not so simple that we could all live on just one spectrum. In fact, a second axis has to be added, and this relates to the question of doikite, which means basically here-ness. Do we believe, political parties or political organizations would argue, in developing Jewish life here, in the diaspora, or do we believe in doing it dort, over there, meaning in Israel? Are we more Zionist inclined than diaspora inclined? So every party has to fit on both of these X and Y axes. If we look in the lower left quadrant where you have socialism and doikite, most important party is the General Jewish Workers Bund, B-U-N-D. that was actually one of the earliest parties to form illegally in the Russian Empire in 1897. It actually claimed a very large number of followers. It was essentially a very leftist agenda that was exercised in the Yiddish language, largely because there was a significant population of blue-collar workers in northern Pale of Settlement, Lithuania in particular, that were very receptive to socialist thinking. And so the Bund really relied on the Jewish proletariat, which was quite significant, particularly in the more industrialized north. By the time you get to the 1917 revolution, there were 30,000 card-carrying members of the Bund. Now, backing up, what about in the quadrant to the lower right? You see that we have this man, Shimon Dubno, who represents the diaspora nationalists, right? They're definitely very big on Doakite. They did not favor the idea of moving to Israel, but they didn't think that the country had to be so radically changed on a socialist agenda. So they're really more existing within a capitalist economic framework. Now, if we go up to the top right quadrant, we have, of course, very important group, the Zionists, and there are many, many shades of Zionist interpretations, but the most significant one was the group that was founded by Theodor Herzl, shown here, the father of modern political Zionism, who in 1897, same year as the Bund, had the General World Zionist Congress. And the movement that he was associated with were called the Allgemeine Zionisten, the general Zionists. It was more of a big tent, large umbrella kind of Zionism. This is contrasted from the revisionists, who are up here, sort of like more extreme Israel, more extreme, not necessarily capitalist economically, but definitely in a kind of political sense. Vladimir Jabotinsky is the most important thinker and activist among the revisionists, and they essentially believed that Herzl was far too diplomatic, that he was far too trusting in the goodwill of the nations that surrounded Israel or the great powers. You know, they felt that Herzl's approach, which was basically a kind of shuttle diplomacy, go here, talk to this important leader, go there, talk to that important leader, and eventually you'll negotiate through and we'll get Israel. Jabotinsky and his followers felt that no, Jews must be much more aggressive. They must be much more militarily trained. They should have more of a kind of a right-wing outlook. These two approaches of Herzl and Jabotinsky essentially formed the core of the political party Likud later when Israel became a state. Finally, if we move over here to the upper left quadrant, you have a very important movement, the Poalei Zion, the workers of Zion, who were definitely very aggressively Zionist, but they felt that it would be a shame if Israel would just be a reproduction of some Western European state. They wanted Israel to be established on socialist principles. They invested heavily in kibbutzim, collective farms, the sort of ideal of the Israeli-born Sabra, who, you know, has a rifle on his back and is hoeing the land and is draining the swamps and things like that. That's kind of like the ideal of Poalei Zion. And this movement is primarily responsible for the core of the Labor Party that dominated much of early Israeli politics. So if you think this is complicated so far, we're not even finished yet, because Jews are not satisfied with two political axes. We have to have a third axis, right? We have X, we have Y, and now we have Z, which is kind of like a third dimension. I'll draw that with sort of like this curved green line, and this represents the religious parties, because up until now, all of these groups have been either anti-religious or neutral on religion. That leaves out a huge number of Jews who still held religious values, and traditional Judaism was sacred to them, and they did not want to, you know, abandon its dictates. So the first group we'll look at are the so-called Mizrahi. These are Orthodox Jews who believe that, contrary to the dominant rabbinic opinion, that somehow working alongside secular Zionists to establish a modern state represented an abrogation of divine will, maybe that was precisely what God wanted. That maybe the coming together of secular Jews for the holy purpose of rebuilding Israel,
Which one?
in
You just
fact
went down the stairs.
represented the gradual unfolding of the Messianic ideal. They
Right.
followed in large part the teachings of this individual,
It's the-
Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was
Ching
a
chong
brilliant scholar who lived in
Everybody
Israel
knows this.
and was a very profound Zionist. Although he was not specifically politically motivated, he didn't lead the party or anything like that, but he was kind of like the ideological founder of many of the ideas that were encapsulated in Mizrahi. And then finally, I am actually saying finally for real right now, we also have those traditionalist Jews, the renewed traditionalists, who did not agree that Zionism should be embraced by religious Jews. And furthermore, they certainly disagreed with everybody on the left side of this spectrum who were anti-religion or at least neutral on religion. They wanted to embrace religion. So these were the groups like the Agudat Yisrael that basically decided to organize themselves in order to defend the rights and opinions of religious Jews. Among their many great achievements are the Siyum Hashas, the Daf Yomi program, which I'm very proud to participate in myself. I do give a little 2 to 5 minute class on every single page of the Talmud, 2,711 folios that over the course of a 7-year cycle, the students of the Talmud complete the entire corpus of the Babylonian Talmud. This is the most recent celebration of the completion of another cycle that was held all over the world. This happens to be a meeting at the MetLife Stadium. I was actually present at this particular celebration. So that's kind of like the things that Agudat Yisrael does. They think about, what do yeshiva students need? What do kollel families need? And they're all sort of like working in politics in order to defend that sort of traditionalism. So that's a graphic representation of how these political orientations developed and relate to each other. It's complicated, I know, but as my father, Oliver Shalom, would always say, Henry, it just gets worse. Okay, I hope you found this enjoyable and enlightening. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's really nice to see that lots more people are interested in studying Jewish history. And if you don't want to miss a lecture, make sure you click on the little bell button on your YouTube so that it'll give you a notification. Hey, a new video is happening or a new premiere is happening where we can actually communicate in real time with the chat. And of course, we have other levels of membership, which give you access to other lectures and live events and things like that. But I'm really happy that you're with me for this video, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next. Thanks very much for watching. Hello and welcome to another edition of Jewish History Lab. Let's move forward into the 20th century and speak a little bit about the fall of the Russian Empire, which was one of the massive events that affected a tremendous number of Jews who were largely concentrated in Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. So this map is crucial. You've really got to understand this map if you want to make any sense out of the first half of the 20th century. On the left side, you see what Europe looked like before World War I. And I'd like to point out in particular that East Central Europe was dominated by 3 large empires, moving from east to west: the Russian Empire, which was made up of many different nationalities, but all under the Tsar Nicholas II, and then Germany, which dominated the Baltic Sea coast, and below it, Austria-Hungary, also a very multi-ethnic state that was actually a dual monarchy. These 3 large empires dominated the region. But after World War I, there were a number of peace treaties that divided these 3 great empires up into much smaller countries and actually resulted in a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction, primarily located in those peoples who lived in these 3 regions, the titular nationalities, meaning the Germans in Germany, the Austrians and Hungarians in Austria-Hungary, and so on. There were a lot of winners, on the other hand, in the post-World War I treaties, and you can see they actually got their own countries. Like, for example, most significantly, Poland, which, of course, was a country prior to the late 18th century, but then it was cynically divided up by its three neighbors and disappeared from the map of Europe. It suddenly reappeared 200 years later. And, this is a tremendous exaltation for the Poles, although there are lots of non-Poles living in Poland, including Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Jews, and a number of other peoples. Then you have Austria and Hungary, which once, this massive country, now they're reduced to tiny little rump states. It's so ironic, for example, Hungary, later on in the 20th century, it would be ruled by Admiral Horthy. And as you can see, Hungary is landlocked. So what are you doing with an admiral in a country that has no natural outlet to the sea? Yugoslavia is created from the remnants of much of Austria-Hungary and so on. And significantly for Germany in particular, the new country of Czechoslovakia, now divided into the Czech lands and Slovakia, but back then one country, Hitler used to refer to it as a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany. So you have a lot of states who are very much into revising the peace treaties, meaning they want to go back and wipe out some of these gains of these new countries or reborn countries, and they want to regain some of the grandeur of old. The Russian Empire, of course, collapses, and we're going to spend most of our time today talking about that, but it's divided into several countries. There is Russia proper, which is basically pushed back significantly towards the east because of where the front lines of the German army were at the end of World War I. And west of those front lines, you have new countries created, Belarus, for example, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Ukraine is created within the Soviet Union that we'll discuss in a second, but it's divided. There are Ukrainians who are on the Polish side of the post-World War I treaty, and there are Ukrainians who are on the Russian side of the post-World War I treaty, and they find themselves within a Soviet orbit. So there's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction among the losers of World War I who are unhappy with these peace treaties, and they want to revise them. Let's focus a little bit more on Russia itself, however. So Russia is extremely complicated at this period of time. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. The first thing you should realize is that there were actually two revolutions in Russia, separated by a few months. They both occurred in the year 1917, although the month in which they occurred depends on where you were standing at the time they occurred. The reason why this is so is because it was only in 1918 that the communists officially adopted the Gregorian calendar that is currently in use in Western Europe and America and so on. Prior to that, they were using the Julian calendar, which does not have the same calculation of leap days. Like in February, we have that leap year. So that meant that quite literally, Russia was 11 days behind the West in their calendar. And so if you look at Russian sources, for example, that were written at that time, they refer to the February Revolution because in Russia it occurred in February. But if you were standing in New York City when the revolution occurred, it would have been in March. So let's just say there was a spring revolution, and it occurred, it began really in Petrograd. There's more confusing stuff. Sorry, I'm throwing lots of stuff, but it gives you a sense of just how tumultuous and how crazy everything was at the time. The city called Petrograd, which means Peter's city, was a Russian renaming of the city that was founded by Peter the Great 100-odd years ago that was called St. Petersburg. The reason why it was no longer called St. Petersburg is because they felt that sounded too German, right? Berg is a German suffix meaning city, so the city of Peter. So they wanted to have a Russian sound because they were fighting with the Germans, so they called it Petrograd. Then, when the communists came to power, they renamed it again because they didn't want it named after a Tsar. They renamed it Leningrad, right? Lenin City. And then, of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century, it was renamed back to its original name of St. Petersburg. Okay, this is all very simple, I know. But it happened in Petrograd where there was a significant march. It happened to occur on International Women's Day, which is March 8th in the Western calendar. It's actually a very important date that they commemorate even to this day in the former Soviet Union and the regions of Eastern Europe. It's different from, let's say, Mother's Day or things like that we do. Well, it's not really important. What's important for us right now is that there was a huge march and a protest that was specifically clamoring for the government to do something about the tremendous food shortages that were occurring as a result of the war. Don't forget, 1917, we're 3 years into World War I, no sign of slowing down. Russia is really hurting badly. They're not able to equip their troops properly. They're telling their soldiers to go into war, and because they don't have enough bullets, they say, use your bayonets first, right? Like, can you imagine you're going up against an enemy and you can't fire? You have to actually use your bayonet, which means get really close to them when they have machine guns and things like that. So it was just a disaster. So there's this protest in Petrograd, and according to some news accounts, a woman took a brick and threw it through a bakery window. Everyone rushed in to get the stolen bread, and this food riot sort of expanded and expanded. It took on more political overtones, and ultimately, within a very short period of time, the Tsar's palace was overrun. The Tsar and his family were arrested. They would be assassinated later, and the Romanov dynasty that had stood for hundreds of years fell in early 1917. What happens immediately after that is it doesn't become communist right away. The Russian Empire becomes a sort of provisional democracy, and it's run by this individual, Alexander Kerensky. They call themselves the provisional government, and the whole idea was that they wanted to establish a modern form of democracy, and they wanted to do it right. They wanted to have massive elections all over the Russian Empire, and they were going to elect a constituent assembly, and this constituent assembly would then, be able to create this democratic federated Russian government. Kerensky was widely admired by the Jewish population because one of the very first acts in his role as the leader of this provisional government is he abolished the hated Pale of Settlement. Here you can see a map of the Pale of Settlement from the Encyclopedia Judaica. It was hated by Jews in the 20th century because it placed all kinds of anti-Semitic restrictions on Jewish activity, Jewish commercial activity, traveling, education, you name it. And Jews were clamoring to have equal rights, and they wanted to be able to, free themselves from the Pale of Settlement if necessary. So Kerensky abolished this highly discriminatory restriction on residence. Here, by the way, you can see another map that gives you a little bit of sense of the density of Jewish population. Some writers from the time considered it a massive ghetto because of the huge concentrations of Jews that were located here. So Kerensky was really trying to do things right, but on the other hand, it was his sheer dedication to doing it properly that ended up bringing the whole thing down to its knees. Because by pushing off all really important discussions, like, for example, should we continue fighting this war? And what are we going to do about, land reallocation? And what about all these peasants and their demands? And what about the urban workers and so on? And they basically couldn't do anything until they had the Constituent Assembly. And by constantly pushing it off until that time when it could be properly constituted, the communists were able to take advantage and ultimately undermine Kerensky's efforts. The genius behind all of it was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, shown here, who was really quite a destabilizing force in Russia during those months between the first revolution in February, March, and the second revolution, which is really the communist revolution of October, November 1917. Here's a piece of propaganda from the era that shows Tovarish Lenin, meaning Comrade Lenin, at the top there with his characteristic soft cap, and he's getting rid of all of the negative classes in the Russian Empire. You can see the various, nobility, and there's the Russian Orthodox clergy at the bottom, and you can see also what looks like a monopoly man. This is sort of the turn of the 20th century caricature of a capitalist. You may recognize the top hat, and typically there's a waistcoat there and usually a bag of money. And quite often, not in this particular example, but quite often the capitalist is, not so thinly veiled disguise for a Jew. Usually it is a Jewish capitalist that's portrayed in these images. The communists, however, were unusually strong on minimizing anti-Semitism at this time, especially in comparison to their rivals like the White Russian movement, the monarchist movement, and some of the anarchists and so on. But we'll get to that in the next video. At any rate, over the course of a few months in 1917, Lenin was able to really mobilize a wide-ranging network of Soviets, which means basically councils. And these are like sort of local groups of leaders who are motivated by socialist ideology, who want to take over the means of production themselves. And you would have Soviets in factories, Soviets in municipalities, and so on. And ultimately, he was able to take over and disband the Constituent Assembly and proclaim the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. That's ultimately what occurred in October of 1917 in Russia, and of course in New York it would have been recorded as November of 1917. Now, just to give you a sense of the kind of tension, here's a piece of White Russian propaganda that gives you a sense of some of the opposition to this communist movement. The White Russians were those Russians who were very much against this new phenomenon. Sometimes they may have been less hostile to the provisional government, but they were definitely hostile to the Soviets. And some of them really wanted to bring back the monarchy. Others wanted perhaps a more gradual approach to a capitalist Russia. At any rate, this poster refers to the death of the International, which is essentially a gathering of socialist thinkers. And the idea was here that Lenin, who's shown here as some kind of weird Aztec priest dressed in red, and next to him with a bloody apron is Trotsky, who we discussed in previous classes, Leon Trotsky, the head of the Red Army, and of course a very prominent Jew, although not an observant Jew at all, but nevertheless he was widely perceived for his Jewish identity. And they are about to slaughter the Russian monarchy there. They're representing Russia on the altar of a statue of Karl Marx with the word international referring to the Socialist International. And the idea is that they're going to sacrifice Russia to communism. And, arrayed around him with their labels on the top as to who's referenced here, Zinoviev is shown with his hands outstretched, another Jewish figure, and so on. There's all of these people who are involved in this secret cabal. And there's this interesting figure here. If you look, I'll zoom in here so you can see him better. This is clearly a secularized Jew with the stereotypical ugly physiognomy that's often applied in these kinds of anti-Semitic pictures. But in case we missed it, he's also got peyos. He's also got forelocks there to indicate he, like many communist Jews of that era, had jettisoned his Jewish identity in order to absorb this new ideology. And he is holding onto a bag, which, as you can see, has the number 30 on it. Now, I'm not positive, but I think what this is referring to is the 30 pieces of gold that Judas accepted to betray Jesus. So there's kind of like an overlaying here of the betrayal theme that goes back to really, really old anti-Semitic tropes. Not exactly sure, but I think that's what that strange number 30 means. At any rate, in the fall of 1917, the Russian Empire, at least those regions that are dominated by the Russian cities like Moscow and Petrograd, become officially communist, and this will tip the entire region into a massive civil war. That's what I'm going to talk about next. Thank you very much for watching. According to some news accounts, a woman took a brick and threw it through a bakery window. Everyone rushed in to get the stolen bread, and this food riot sort of expanded and expanded. It took on more political overtones, and ultimately, within a very short period of time, the Tsar's palace was overrun. The Tsar and his family were arrested. They would be assassinated later. And it gives you a sense of just how tumultuous and how crazy everything was at the time. They call themselves the Provisional Government, and the whole idea that was that they wanted to establish a modern form of democracy, and they wanted to do it right. The communists were able to take advantage and ultimately undermine Kerensky's efforts. The genius behind all of it was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, shown here. Tovarishch Lenin, meaning Comrade Lenin at the top there with his characteristic soft cap, and he's getting rid of all of the negative classes. Hello and welcome to another installment of the Jewish History Lab. I'd like to pick up where we left off yesterday with the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Soviet Union, and take it further into the disastrous civil war period that followed. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the experience of Jews in Ukrainian lands, primarily because that's actually something I know something about, believe it or not. Before we go on, though, have a look at this page here, which shows you a remarkable artifact of that unusual era. This is a 100 Karbovanets bill from the brief-lived independent Ukrainian state. And as you can see, on the upper left, it has the word "sto Karbovanets" in Ukrainian, right? Of course, an official language of the country. And on the right, you see it says the same thing in Polish, because Polish was an official language. And then at the bottom, underneath the number 100, you see in Yiddish, 100 Karbovances, which is an amazing thing. Yiddish was actually an official language of this brief-lived Ukrainian state. We'll have to see what exactly happened there. The reason why I mentioned I actually know something about this is because this was the topic of my PhD dissertation. I did a ridiculous amount of primary research in several archives around the world, and several of them in the former Soviet Union, and eventually came out with this book, which I'm proud to say still has some readers. It has been reprinted, and it's been translated as well by a fairly important publishing house there, Duchy Litera. And so if you're curious, you can get it in either English or in Ukrainian, whatever you like. At any rate, what I focused on was this unusual period of time in which there was a remarkable rapprochement, that is a coming together, a meeting of minds of populations that had lived in a kind of, difficult symbiosis for a very long time, for centuries. And that, of course, is the Jewish and the Ukrainian populations. They were very, very different populations. The Ukrainians were overwhelmingly agricultural, the Jews overwhelmingly living in villages, towns, and cities. The Ukrainians were the dominant population, a large part of the population, but had very little power in the urban centers. And the Jews, on the other hand, highly literate, highly numerate, long oppressed and restricted by Russian authorities, but now looking for an opportunity to express themselves nationally. And because of the collapse of the Russian Empire, that suddenly became possible. So under the period of the provisional government, there were more and more linkages between the Jews and the Ukrainians, and they began to talk about perhaps creating some kind of new democratic society together. When Russia became communist, that we spoke about in the previous lecture, this became much more significant. The Jewish parties who were more left-leaning, the socialist Jewish parties, were very, very uncomfortable, but there were a lot of Jewish organizations that felt much more at home with the Ukrainians than they did with the Russians, which is an upsetting moment, because for a long time, Jews had exhibited, if they had any kind of alliance with a larger population, it tended to be much more Russotropic. This is, by the way, a very old phenomenon where minorities tend to ally themselves with the ruling power rather than allying themselves with oppressed parts of a society, because obviously as a minority it's dangerous to be on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, when it comes to this kind of thing. So they ended up allying themselves with the Ukrainians as they moved more and more towards independence, even from the Russians, because originally they had viewed themselves as part of a larger Russian federated society, that perhaps the Russians were the most significant of the nationalities, but the Ukrainians would have significant powers to themselves. And they began to move towards total independence, which was definitely a big break for the Ukrainians as well. And so during this period of time, there was actually a remarkable effervescence of a new spirit of cooperation between Ukrainians and Jews, and it was extremely important because the Jews were, quite a significant population. Here's a map taken from the research of my PhD supervisor, Dr. Paul Robert Magochi, who is one of the great world experts of Ukrainian history. And you can see here the tremendous concentration of Jews, where in much of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory, shown with the blue border, Jews constitute more than 15% of the population. That's particularly true in so-called right bank Ukraine, because they're on the right bank of the Dnieper River, which flows from north to south. Very, very heavy Jewish populations there. And so this idea of a connection between Ukrainians and Jews was very much appreciated by at least the urban literate Jews, perhaps less so by the wider population, but nevertheless, there was a certain amount of general enthusiasm. But, this is a chaotic time. Remember, this is all happening at the very end of World War I. There are German troops that are demobilizing, frequently without support from Germany. They're selling their arms and trying to make their way home on their own. There's a civil war brewing to the north, with Russia going communist and Ukraine not going communist. There are bands of anarchists that are wandering free, and there's no state power of any authority that actually can control any of this. Of course, it would explode into a bloody period of civil war and violence. But before that, let's just look at this document, which gives you a sense of how tenuous this rapprochement between Ukrainians and Jews were. This is a document that I found in the archives, typical of hundreds of documents from this period here. And it's actually a document related to a particular Jewish community, and you can see that it is written in Ukrainian. That's the Slavic Cyrillic alphabet on the left of the page, but the typewriter that was used to write it was a Russian typewriter. And so there are certain, half a dozen odd letters in the Ukrainian alphabet that the Russians do not have. And so whenever they had the letter I, which you can see in the first line of text there, the typist had to actually leave a blank space, and then afterwards actually physically write in longhand a letter I, because the typewriter wouldn't tolerate Ukrainian. It gives you a sense of that. And by the way, for those of you who were born after, let's say, 1985, typewriters are kind of like word processors, except that you can't go back and delete things. You have to write it exactly the way it turns out the first time, and then make it into a hard copy. It actually becomes a hard copy as you do it. And well, I'm not going to explain to you the technology. It is kind of weird. And then on the right, you see they've added in the Yiddish translation of the same document. Of course, there's no Yiddish typewriters, so the whole thing has to be written in by hand. But it just gives you a sense of how, they were trying to piece these things together without the right equipment, even to type up their orders. But nevertheless, it has certain kind of youthful exuberance that in many ways made the period, emblematic of the best that could have happened. Unfortunately, it all collapsed in terrible, terrible violence, primarily because of the pogroms that were especially bad in the year 1919. Now, there are many, many forces who were active in Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory that were guilty of perpetrating pogroms. The White Russians, who we talked about in the previous lecture, who were monarchist, anti-communist Russians who wanted to, either restore the Tsar if possible, or if not, at least go back to some kind of provisional government, but certainly not the communists. They engaged in very brutal attacks on Jews. There are a number of foreign armies. A Polish army was there. And there were also bands of roving anarchists, particularly the Greens, people like Nestor Makhno, who were associated with attacks on civilian populations. Not only Jews, Mennonites, for example, suffered. Poles also suffered when they were, far away from large Polish centers. And it was a very, very bloody period of time. The numbers of deaths are very, very difficult to calculate, but certainly in the tens of thousands. Reasonable estimates of 50 to 60,000. Terrible, terrible time. And really, if it were not for the Holocaust that would occur only 20 years later, this would be considered one of the greatest periods of violence perpetrated against the Jews since, temple times. It's definitely much worse than the Crusades. It's arguably much worse even than the Khmelnytsky massacres of the 17th century. And nevertheless, because the Holocaust and its much greater violence so deeply overshadowed this period, we tend to forget about it. Now, when I did my research back in the 1980s, 1990s, I really had to rely heavily on archival sources and secondary sources that were largely written in the 1920s. But my colleague Jeffrey Weidlinger has written really a remarkable book called In the Midst of Civilized Europe, The Pogroms of 1918, 1921, which really treats the violence of this period in a much more significant and comprehensive manner. And it's really, I'll put the link in the notes to this because it's really a phenomenal work. At any rate, let's go back to where we are. From the point of view of Ukrainian-Jewish relations, however, and specifically with regard to that remarkable period that I described at the beginning of this lecture, one of the most tragic elements of this period is that roughly 40% of the pogroms that were recorded were attributed to the Ukrainian Directory forces under the control of this man, Simon Petliura. Now, we have to place this into a lot of context. Simon Petliura was a former journalist who early on in his career had actually exhibited some significant philo-Semitic tendencies. He had written some positive things about Jews in his work and so on. But as the leader of this very tenuous Ukrainian political movement, which could claim maybe 100,000 troops at its disposal at the beginning of 1919, found himself beleaguered and under tremendous attack by forces from all sides. Not only the Soviets, but also the Whites, the Greens, and so on. And his government at one point was literally reduced to operating out of train cars, moving from station to station in a triangle towards the western part of the region. And his troops rapidly diminished from 100,000 down to 16,000 within the space of a few months as they largely deserted the Ukrainian cause. But nevertheless, there was a period of time, particularly in the spring of 1919, in which there were a lot of pogroms happening, and Petliura did not act forcefully and demonstratively to end that violence against Jews. Later, towards the summer, he would issue some very strong condemnations of violence against Jews and so on. Many critics feel that these later statements were largely created for public consumption to try and bolster the flagging fortunes of the Ukrainian movement. But unlike the Soviets, who were much more effective in controlling the violence directed against Jews, Simon Petliura was rather silent for a period of several key weeks in the spring of 1919, for which many scholars, myself included, hold that he has a degree of responsibility for that violence. What ultimately happens is the Jews who are beleaguered and are attacked on all sides by many of these forces, and many locations are actually pogromized several times. They recognize that the Jewish Red Army leader, Leon Trotsky, is being much more effective in controlling his troops, that the Red Army is associated, not 100% completely, but nevertheless associated with protecting Jewish communities. And so there is a surge of support in 1919 for the communist movement in general and for the Red Army in particular. So much so that the Red Army had to set up special training programs for these Yiddish-speaking youths, some of them, literally piling out of yeshivas in order to pick up a gun that they'd never touched one before in their life, in order to defend their communities, and they do so under the banner of communism. We'll continue with what happens to these people in the next lecture, but for now, let us just jump ahead a little bit to 1926. The Ukrainian movement, of course, failed with the Russian onslaught, and with the exception of the part of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territory that is absorbed by interwar Poland, most Ukrainians find themselves now as part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, dominated by Moscow. Petliura and some of his close associates flee, and they make their way to Paris, where one day, walking out of a cafe, Mr. Petliura runs into an unfamiliar figure named Shalom Schwarzbard, shown here in this photograph from his trial. Schwarzbard, this is in Paris, says to him, "Vous êtes Monsieur Petlura?" And Petlura says, "Oui." And Schwarzbard pulls out a revolver and shoots him dead on the spot. He is immediately arrested, and he's taken to trial for, assassinating someone right there on the streets of Paris. But his defense attorneys are mobilized by a fascinating and ultimately successful defense. They claim that Schwarzbard was acting out of revenge for the pogroms that occurred under Petlura's watch in Ukraine. And the trial, ostensibly of a man who shot another man in cold blood on the street of Paris, ultimately became a trial about Petlura's guilt or innocence in the early period of this fledgling Ukrainian state. The French jury, perhaps smarting from the embarrassment of the Dreyfus affair 30 years earlier, ultimately rendered a verdict in favor of Schwarzbard, ordering him to pay 1 franc in damages, very insulting, to Petlura's widow, and allowed him to go free. This was like a huge victory for Jews around the world who regarded Schwarzbard as an avenger of the massacres of the pogroms. According to my research, and I invite you to look at my book if you want more details in the argument, it's very difficult to understand Petlura as, let's say, an architect of the pogroms, some kind of proto-Hitler. That doesn't seem to be an appropriate description of his responsibility at all. At the same time, there was that period of several weeks when he could have at least made a statement, but I would argue that perhaps he refrained from doing so because he had no way of controlling his troops. He had no resources even to provide for them, to feed them and so on. And if he were to limit their violent activities, he might lose them even faster than he ultimately ended losing them. Ultimately, he would lose the entire country as well. But that, I think, is probably a more reasonable assessment of his personal responsibility in the pogroms. At any rate, we will have to continue this discussion with Jews in the now communist Ukraine and the rest of the USSR. Thank you very much for watching this video. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. In the last installment of the Jewish History Lab, we looked at the terrible pogroms of the Civil War period. As we discussed there, ultimately the Soviet forces, the Red Army, were able to seize control of those areas where Jews primarily lived in the former Pale of Settlement. And once they were able to establish Soviet rule over the entire region, they began to impose the very different philosophy and political system that was associated with early communism. And that's the period that I'd like to look at today. I'd like to look at the period from the end of the Civil War up until really the last couple of years of the Civil War, right up until World War II, because it was a tremendously expansive time in some ways and restrictive in other ways. Let us begin with a discussion of the Yevsektia. The Soviets are very, very fond of acronyms. It's an abbreviation of the term Yevreysky Sektia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And this was a segment of the Communist Party that was formed under this individual, Simon Diemenstein, a communist who actually was previously a Chabad rabbi, who was thoroughly defrocked, as it were, and completely removed from his religious moorings. That's the kind of thing that frequently happened with those Jews who associated themselves with communism in this early period. Diemenstein was assigned the task of propagandizing this largely very traditional population, that traditional specifically when you get outside of the large cities where there's much less secularism, much more old traditional observance in the Städtlach, the small villages that dotted the now Soviet countryside, and bringing them into this brand new, radically atheistic, totally different economic system, and divorcing them from their Jewish roots, while at the same time successfully bringing them forward into this new Soviet era. Definitely a great challenge, and they evolved some really interesting strategies to try and do it. In the general political environment in the first few years was especially dire. The period 1918 to 1920 is generally called the era of war communism. And during this period of war communism, when the Civil War was still being prosecuted and there were still, numerous forces, including in particular the Ukrainian Directory and Makhno and the anarchists and the White Russian forces, that is the Russians who wanted to bring back some form of the monarchy or at least get rid of the communists and establish some kind of more capitalist society in its place. The communists were still fighting this war in real time, and war communism as a kind of like a temporary period characterized their attempts to rapidly bring the entire population into the very doctrinaire policies of communism as a whole, including things like, confiscation of land and collectivization of farming, bringing individual farmers together into a larger collective. This would ultimately slow down and then speed up dramatically later, about a decade later, under communism. The outlawing of all kinds of forms of commerce and, shutting down capitalist enterprises, being very, very aggressively attacking any kind of religious behavior and so on. And this went on for about 2 years. Confiscations of Torah scrolls from synagogues, real persecution, but it was across the board, not just Jews, obviously. Any religious individual in this newly atheistic society felt definitely very out of place. This was followed as the war began to calm down and as the anti-Soviet forces were slowly quelled, and it was replaced by something called NEP, which was another acronym, this time in English, for the New Economic Program. This was what was generally conceded as kind of like a one step backward in order to later take 2 steps forward. And, the new regime could not maintain this phenomenal energy of demanding, confiscating, ordering people around for such a long period of time, especially exhausted after these years of war, which you'll recall immediately followed after World War I, right? World War I just ended in November 1918. The new economic policy was kind of like just relaxing some of these controls a little bit and allowing the economy to kind of develop again slightly. Ultimately, NEP would be shut down, but for a brief period of time, till about 1924, that began to, sort of take the knee off the neck of the larger population, and the new Soviet Union began to recover. In terms of the leadership, let's just recall that there is a triumvirate that are especially important at this time. There are other figures that are also very important, like Bukharin, but if we focus on the triumvirate, there is, of course, Lenin, who is the first leader of the Soviet Union. He has a stroke in 1922, if I remember correctly, that renders him incapacitated. And he lives for a couple more years, but during that time, which was during the period of NEP, there was a big question as to who was going to be his successor. There are some who favored Trotsky, the Jewish leader of the Red Army, who had shown tremendous skill at expanding the control of the Soviet Union. But others favored Stalin, who was a much more brutal individual coming from Georgia. He was an expert on the nationalities question, which was sort of communist speak for the non-Russians who lived within the Soviet Union. Of course, there's a lot of non-Russians living in the Soviet Union. And he ultimately would end up very cleverly maneuvering himself around Trotsky, around Bukharin after Lenin's death, and ultimately he would become the leader. And the 30s were dominated by Stalin right up until his death in the early 1950s. So back to where we are. Diemenstein was placed in charge of the Jewish section of the Communist Party, and this was initially during the period of war communism, but during the period of NEP, he saw that he had quite a bit more freedom to explore the methodology of bringing the Jewish population into communism. Let us recall that although there was a disproportionate number of Jews in the Communist Party for their population. And this is especially true as you move up towards the leadership of the Soviet Union, where there was like sometimes a third of governing bodies were dominated by Jews. There used to be a joke in Yiddish that there was an acronym VITSIK, which referred to the All Russian Central Committee, Всероссийский Центральный Комитет, and in Yiddish they would say that it wasn't a Russian acronym; it was a Yiddish acronym for Vutsen Eden Kommandieren, where 10 Jews are in charge. That was not a truism. You never had a majority of Jews anywhere in any institution of the Soviet Union, but there were very important influential Jews, and they were out of proportion to their size of the population. That said, the proportion of Jews who became communists was tiny. There was the vast majority of Jews were hostile to communism, seeing it as a threat to their traditional way of life, especially those who were religiously oriented, who recognized the threat of the anti-clerical nature of the Soviet Union. So it's a great complex of issues involved here. The thing that made the Soviet Union very popular in the Civil War period, as we discussed in the previous lecture, was the fact that Trotsky's Red Army forces were far less likely to commit pogroms than the other forces that were ravaging the countryside. That engendered an enthusiastic support for the Red Army that was translated initially in the early 1920s to support for the Soviet Union. But as we shall see, it rapidly declined. The policy that Diemenstein seized upon, which was generally issued during the more liberal period of the 1920s for all of the non-Russian nationalities, was a policy that went by the name Korenizatsiya. This is kind of a strange word. It's difficult to translate into English. The word koren can mean like a root. And so it can be translated as rootification, like roots as in a tree, or I've seen it translated as indigenization, which kind of like was a way of thinking about the general society and identifying those elements of the indigenous culture which were compatible with communism and actively encouraging those factors. The slogan of the era was nationalist in form, but socialist in content, meaning they could wear their national costumes, they could eat their national foods, they could speak their national language, as long as none of the things that they did or said challenged the economic and political ideology of communism, right? Nationalist in form, okay, but socialist in content. As soon as they got into things like, a level of ethnocentrism, that would be definitely not socialist in content. If they wanted to defend their national religion, definitely not socialist in content. So this idea of Korenizatsiya was kind of reaching into the roots with this kind of like, theory operating that communism was the true form of human organization. And if you dug below the accreted layers of corruption that came in from bourgeois democracy, you would find that people are naturally communist and they just spoke different language, kind of like, happily wearing embroidered dresses or dancing the hora, whether they eat kreplach or whether they ate, I don't know, perohe, and whatever it would be, they would still be naturally communist if only you could get past all those other things. So that's the policy of Korenizatsiya. And what Diemenstein did was he took that material and he said, let us go to the Jewish people with the authentic element of their cultures and talk to them about communism. Now, there were a few challenges, one of which really huge was this idea of atheism, right? Because Jews are overwhelmingly united by their religion. Even when they're rebelling against their religion, they still regard themselves as some kind of, loose tribal familial affiliation that is rooted in a long religious tradition. And this was anathema to the Soviet cause. So one of the things that the Soviet Union stood up in the 1920s was an institution called the League of Militant Atheists. Sounds almost funny, actually. And this was targeting all religions, of course, not just Judaism. They published this magazine here. This is called Bezbozhnik, which means literally godless. And in this particular anti-Christian image, they're showing obviously Jesus, who is getting all of the various followers drunk to the point of vomiting, and really trying to illustrate Marx's idea of, religion being an opiate of the masses, that religion keeps you drunk, religion keeps you high and unable to appreciate your true class enemies and things like that. So there was a Yiddish version of Bezbozhnik, and there were tremendous amounts of effort placed in trying to do things, crazy things, like rewrite the Haggadah, rewrite the Passover liturgy. They wrote a red Haggadah that celebrated, Stalin and Marx instead of Moses, that, Pharaoh was portrayed as the Tsar and all kinds of things like this. And they used the Yiddish language in particular to try and get this material across. Yiddish was considered the true folk language of the Soviet Jewish people, even though it's essentially medieval German written in Hebrew characters. But that was the native tongue of 97, 98% of the Jewish people at the end of the 19th century, living in the region of the Russian Empire. And so they said, we'll speak to them and we'll write to them in their Yiddish language. And so there was just a flourishing of attention lavished on anything in Yiddish which would be considered compatible with Soviet culture. A lot of money was spent on Yiddish writers. There was a renaissance of Yiddish poetry. You actually have Yiddish writers leaving America to go back to Russia because they saw this as a tremendous, culture effervescence. And in fact, in the 1920s, it looked very encouraging that Yiddish would have a tremendous heyday. Now, it was not a normal Yiddish, I have to say, because, the more they poked around with it, the more they messed it up. Yiddish is, as I mentioned, written in Hebrew characters, and it is heavily populated by Hebraic terms, Aramaic terms as well. And Hebrew was considered outside of the pale because that was too closely associated with religion. And also in modern Hebrew, it was too closely associated with Zionism, also not compatible with Soviet thought. So, what do you do when you have common Hebrew words in the Yiddish language? Like, for example, chaver, which is translated into Russian as tovarich, as in English, comrade. How do you, speak Yiddish without the word comrade in the Soviet Union? So what they would do is say, okay, you can keep the word chaver, but you have to write it out phonetically, spell it phonetically, rather than spelling it with the traditional Hebrew spelling. So for those of you who are familiar with the letters, the word for chaver in Hebrew and in Yiddish is chet vet resh, 3 letters. But in Yiddish, in the Soviet period, it will be written chaf aleph vav vav ayin resh, which is 6 letters. And if you didn't know what you're looking at, you'll be totally confused when you saw it. So many words were written like this. And by the way, once again, the Soviets attacked all of the nationalities in this form. The Ukrainians, for example, had a letter G, which is distinct from the Russian letter G. And so they actually made the Ukrainian letter G illegal. If you use the Ukrainian letter G rather than the letter that looked like the letter H and pronounced it like a Russian letter H, you could be sent to Siberia. Here's something I find really ironic and amusing. This is the Russian translation of the Hebrew prayer book, the Siddur, which of course would have been totally off limits to these very atheistic Russians. And you can see in Cyrillic letters, it has the large word Siddur, right, the prayer book. And then underneath, you see it has the words Tehillat Hashem, which means the Psalms of God or the songs of God. And the word Hashem, of course, is pronounced with the letter H, but there is no letter H in the Russian alphabet. So in order to indicate that it should be pronounced as an H, they took the letter G, you can see in the second word there, and they added a small accent mark on the top to let you know that you should pronounce this as an H. So it's really very ironic, because one of the things that the Yevsektia did was they looked at 5 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the so-called manatzpach, that are written differently at the end of a word than if they were written at the beginning of the word. And they said those letters are illegal. You can't use those 5 letters They're essentially like capital letters because it's too hard for people to learn. It's not proletarian. We should have a simple language, a simple alphabet. So they tried to take away these 5 letters from the Yiddish alphabet, like they tried to take away the G from the Ukrainian alphabet. And so in return, we forced a new letter on them, right? You can see the word Hashem, that H is actually an imposition into the Russian alphabet in order to accommodate a Hebrew sound. Ironic. Okay, so back to where we are. So during the 1920s explosion of Yiddish activity under the Yevsektia, and one last detail, this actually occurred a little bit afterwards, but it's still quite fascinating. At one point, the Soviet Union even experimented with creating a kind of alternative Israel. They created a homeland, a Jewish autonomous oblast called Birobidzhan, which was way out in the border with China. It was 4,000 miles away from where Jews were actually living. And the idea was, we're going to make a homeland for Jews. You don't have to think about Israel. You don't have to be constantly pressuring us to go to Israel. You have your own homeland in Birobidzhan. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing. Yiddish was made an official language of Birobidzhan and stuff like that, but they had very few Jews actually live there, primarily because Stalin blocked a lot of the migration there exactly when the Jews could have used it during World War II. At any rate, to sum up, the 1920s, period of incredible creativity, although very atheistic, but a huge surge of popularity of Yiddish language culture in particular. This came crashing to a halt in the 1930s under this man, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was able, by the end of the 1920s, to firmly consolidate his control over the entire region. And he had very little patience for all of these kind of national inform and socialist and content experiments. He shut down the Yevsektia. Incidentally, another organization that he also shut down was the women's section of the Communist Party that had exactly the same lifespan as the Jewish section. And Stalin said, we have to focus ourselves on industrialization. He instituted a number of 5-year plans which were designed to rapidly propel the Soviet Union into modernity by building massive things like huge hydroelectric dams at Dnipropetrovsk and other places like that. But he created this kind of environment in which people were desperately pressured to report results. And what ended up happening was that people were faking the results rather than, tell the truth to power and say, hey, we can't possibly produce this much pig iron over this amount of time, or we can't possibly harvest that much grain in this much time. One of the most terrifying and awful results of the 5-year plans was the Holodomor, this massive terror famine that in particular affected the Ukrainian regions. In 1932-33, a huge number of people, it's very difficult to get a good sense of exactly how many. Reasonable estimates are around 5 or 6 million, though. A huge number of people, and there are larger estimates as well. This colossally awful artificial famine, which killed millions of people, was largely a result of the disastrous economic planning of Stalin and his henchmen. It was actually a terrifically horrible event. And in context with the Holodomor and several other related factors, the purges began in the Soviet Union, especially towards the end of the 1930s. As people began to see that the glorious reports of Soviet productivity were not evident in reality, rather than say, wait a second, maybe people are exaggerating their findings about how much they're able to produce. Instead, they blamed non-existent saboteurs, that there were wreckers, there were people who were somehow deciding to stand in the way of progress for the Soviet Union. And these people were identified, tortured, and forced to divulge the names of other saboteurs. This created this ecosystem of purges that was not at all unlike the Spanish Inquisition, in which heresy was hunted out everywhere. People were taken and tortured and asked to betray the names of other heretics and so on. And even if a person wasn't a heretic or didn't even know any heretics, they were nevertheless under the pain of torture and give up all kinds of names. This initiated a horrific cycle of arrest, torture, confession, arrest, torture, confession, that resulted in millions of people, again, the scale is phenomenal, being exiled to the Gulag out in Siberia or even executed. And this really consumed the Soviet Union in the later 1930s. And at this point, the Jewish enthusiasm for the Soviet Union collapsed dramatically. Prominent Jews were purged early on in this period of Stalinist cleansing of the party and then later of society. And Jews, with a few significant exceptions, like Kaganovich, who was involved in Ukraine during the years of the Holodomor, with the exception of a few characters, much of the Soviet leadership was purged of its Jewish membership, and the kind of popularity that the Red Army enjoyed in 1919 was nowhere to be seen, as people around the world began to realize what Stalin really stood for. So by the time you get to the late 1930s, what was once a more significant participation of some Jews in the Communist Party was reduced to a tiny, tiny remnant. And this is where we're going to have to pick up the story next when we look at the Holocaust, because the memory of Jewish participation in the communist movement had tremendously disastrous results when World War II broke out. Thank you very much for watching. Hello and welcome to another episode of Jewish History Lab. Today we're going to begin discussing the Holocaust, one of the most difficult chapters in the long history of the Jewish people. Please note that this information is intended for educational content only. I will only be speaking very briefly about the Holocaust within the context of this series, but if you are curious and are motivated to learn more, I have an entire online course which is specifically on the topic of the Holocaust, and it is free and open to the community. Please see the lecture notes for a link to that particular course. What I'd like to do today is to speak a little bit about the interwar period and the Jews. But let us begin first with a discussion of the terminology. What is this word Holocaust? Where does it come from, and why do we use that term? So the Holocaust itself, obviously we're speaking about the Nazi attempt to destroy the Jews of Europe during World War II. It was such a tremendum, such a huge and audacious act of brutality that it begged a specific term to try to capture what it referred to. In the 1940s through the 1970s, various terms were tossed about to try and capture the sense of this historical event. Probably the first term that was used is the word genocide, which was coined by this man, Raphael Lemkin, in 1944. And the term comes from the words genos, meaning people, or class in the sense of a class of family, and side, meaning to kill, like as in homicide or suicide or patricide, that kind of thing. So genocide means the killing of a people. And that term was very useful and, of course, has entered the English language, but it lacks a specific Jewish context. It doesn't specifically address the fact that the Nazis really targeted the Jews. There were other people, such as the Roma and Sinti and others, but the Jews really were high on the list of targeted populations, and so genocide is a little bit too generic. A term that began to be used in the 1960s is Holocaust. Here's a poster from a film that popularized the Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep and others. And where does this term come from? So actually, it's kind of a problematic term. It is a word taken from the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible. The translation,
Meryl Streep, right?
Taken from this term comes from the Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep and others.
Sounds like
poster from a film that popularized the Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep and others. And where does this term come from? So actually, it's kind of a problematic term. It is a word taken from the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible. The translation is called the Vulgate. And in Leviticus
What's all
chapter
this other
29,
bullshit?
by the way, it's a different numbering system as well
Dog.
in the Hebrew Bible. The verse in Leviticus uses the term Holocaust as a translation for the Hebrew term Olah, which means a sacrifice that is completely burned up.
Hangover.
And in the verse in Leviticus, it talks about offering a Holocaust with a pleasing order to God. Now,
Hey, what's
the
up?
term definitely
48
has
minutes
some
ago.
value to it. It definitely has a sense
Dog,
of
I don't
everything
want to
being
fucking do
burned
any
up,
of that
even
shit.
though, you know, the majority
Dog.
of the victims in the
This
Holocaust were
shit
not
sucks.
actually burned to death. They were gassed to death or shot, and others, but still it does have some kind of totality to it. But
I'm
at
going
the
to sing
same
a
time,
song for
it has
everyone right now, and
theological
it's called
problems.
This Shit
Like, are we
Sucks.
actually going
And
to
it's one
say
and a two
that
and a 1, 2, 3.
if the
This shit sucks,
Jews
this shit sucks,
are
this shit
serving
sucks, this
as
shit
the sacrificial
sucks.
lamb,
This
so
shit
to
sucks,
speak,
this shit sucks, this
what does
shit
that
sucks,
make the Nazis?
this shit sucks.
How do we
This
say
shit
that
sucks, this
connects
shit sucks,
to
this shit sucks,
God
this shit
perceiving a
sucks.
pleasing
This shit sucks.
odor? These are very problematic terms. So for that reason, many religious thinkers prefer not to use the term Holocaust, and they rely on the Hebrew term korban, which means destruction, and that term korban is specifically connected to the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era and the year 70 of the Common Era. So for religious thinkers,
what is an e-girl? I still don't know. Is that an electronic girl, like a robot, or is that a girl?
But it also
who likes
adds a kind of religious coloration that is problematic for more secular users.
All right,
In
are you
Israel,
done?
The most popular term is undoubtedly Shoah,
Hey, everybody.
also a Hebrew term that occurs in the Bible, but it does not have that same connotation of connecting it to the destruction of the temples and the, theological.
You guys want to hear my song? It goes like this.
Last term.
This is in honor of everybody. It goes like this. Frantical weed. No one knows what this means. Frantical
weed. The term
weed.
extermination. The
Dog,
extermination
this
of the
is
Jews
just the
in Europe.
worst.
Extermination is the term we use for vermin.
This
which
is the
plays
worst.
right into the Nazi ethic with regards
I'd love
to
to sing a song for
destruction
everybody.
of this population of people. And there are certain terms like final solution and
goes like
Lösung,
this.
which were actually coined by Nazis themselves. Here you see a mugshot of Hermann Goering from the Nuremberg
like
trials, and he used
this
terms
is
like
the
this,
worst
end
song
seal, the
I've
end
ever
goal,
heard.
things like that. So Holocaust
This
is
is
a
the
difficult
worst.
term to use. It has some
The
problems
worst.
with it, but nevertheless, it is the term that has become most popular in the English language, and so therefore we will use it for expediency. So when we go to the historical data here, the Jews in Europe at this time, you can see this map, which comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Is that
they're spread out across
electronic
Europe.
girls or
great mass of
girls who like
in
electronics?
Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union and in
I think
Poland
it's
in
gamer girls or
particular.
something.
Germany
Has something
has
to do
only
with
about
fucking wearing cat ears. I know that.
Jews. They tend to be
Why?
highly
Those bitches
assimilated.
have those
They
things.
tend
Are
to
you
speak
done?
German very well, dress like Germans,
Yo,
tend
this
to
shit
have
sucks.
less
Hey everybody,
outward
let's
adherence
make the most
to
difficult to
traditional,
understand fucking
Jewish
platform
observance,
ever.
whereas
Oh, you wanted to
move the
find your
east, you have a
shit?
lot more of the masses
Do you remember
of,
its picture?
Traditional Hasidic and Lithuanian Jews.
Well, how about this?
Who are much more obviously Jewish from without. But that didn't stop anti-Semitism from spreading.
We make them
Germany
gifts.
in particular. In fact,
like
a
things
lot
that you
of
give to people.
the
Fuck no,
anti-Semitism
that's
the Nazis relied
gifts,
on had
baby.
a specific
What in the
coloration. We've
fuck?
spoken in previous lectures about the development of anti-Semitism
Worst.
through several phases,
Oh, there it is.
from ancient xenophobia to medieval Jew hatred. And when you get to the modern period, there is a very kind of quasi-scientific quality
What
to
does
it,
that mean? No one
which
knows.
The
A bunch
Nazis
of bullshit.
have largely abandoned the outwardly religious aspect
Dog, what is this?
of previous.
This is the
forms of
worst. If
anti-Semitism.
anybody ever sees
And
this
they
in the
focus
future
on
and you're
this
like, this is the
racial
worst thing
quality
I've ever
connected
seen,
with the idea
like I
of
know. And I have
conspiracy,
3 fucking years of it.
specifically that the
They're gonna be like,
Jews constitute a distinct
Really?
kind
I'm
of
like,
race
yeah. Like, is it all this boring?
that are
You're like,
altogether
yeah.
joined in a global
Is any of it more exciting than
conspiracy
this,
to
Mike?
dominate
No.
other races.
No, this is
And the
it.
way in
This
which
is
they
what we got.
dominate, which obviously
So what
is
are we
very
doing?
difficult
What's so
because
fucking
the Jews
exciting
are a
about
tiny
this?
minority of the population. Is
Well, I'm trying to
specifically
get
in some
into it. I
kind
think it's
of,
called Ego Paradise.
cancerous
Ego
or
Lounge. What is it called?
bacteriological
E-Girl
form. Like, for example, here you
World.
see
Ego World.
a
And this
German
thing's over here
language novel
just
from
sucking
1920
mad cock.
that,
Not even
shows
major cock. This is the world
hideous
of
kind
mad
of,
cock.
vulture
Oh,
that's
there you go.
weighed
Dating
down
lounge.
this
Discord.gg
man.
/
And what this picture is meant
e-dating.
to say is that the
Baby, I don't
Jews
e-date. I just
are
I
like
eat fuck.
carrion
What's an
eaters.
e-fuck?
They're vermin.
I'll
They
teach you what
live
you fuck
off
is, girl.
decay.
What is
They're
this
going
fucking
to
bullshit?
dominate the
Why won't
otherwise
this fucking
healthy,
thing load?
strong, muscular
Does anybody
Aryan
see this
races,
shit?
and
It's
once
such
they
horse
eat
shit.
them out
This
like
thing's
a
over here like, hey,
cancer
guys.
from within.
Oh, you
then
wanted
they
to join
will
the
feed
thing?
on their corpses.
Fuck
The
you.
title, by the way, reads "Die Sünde will das Blut," ein Zeitroman.
What
The
is this
Sin
horseshit?
Against
What
the
is
Blood,
this?
a novel of the times.
Yo, dog.
And the fact that
Ghosts.
the Jews of Germany
What
were
is this
were much more
bullshit, dog?
assimilated actually fed into a lot of this, such as, for
That was
example, and
the
you see
worst idea you've
really
ever had.
bizarre
This,
form of children's
Hey,
propaganda
guys.
published in the 1930s by Elvira Bauer, a really
Terrible.
twisted kindergarten teacher who became propagandist.
terrible
This
idea.
is a book
Okay,
for
so you
children
just
called
closed
Der
it. Now you're
Giftpilz,
reopening it.
The
Kids, I
poison
just want everybody to
toadstool,
know.
right? And the thing about
Anybody in the
toadstools
future
is
who
that they
sees
look like
this,
mushrooms,
if you're involved
but
in
unless you are very
technology,
careful and
you
you know
are
the signs,
not a
you'll
good
always
person
mistake them for
because
healthy mushrooms.
you didn't stand up
You
against
might
the
eat one of these, but it's
technocracy
actually poison.
that
So
is
too, the metaphor goes
discriminating
that the
against
Jews
women.
look like regular
But
Germans,
I'm standing
but in
up for
reality,
women.
they are quite distinct, racially
So like,
different.
oh yeah, I
and
used
they
to work at Google
represent
like
a
7
threat.
years ago.
That's
No,
the kind of
you're
thing
an
that goes
asshole
on in
because you
that
could have stood up for him.
piece of propaganda.
How
The
about
Nazis
Oh, dude, this
frequently
thing's working
referred to
like a
Jews
bitch.
as various kinds
Really?
of vermin
Hi,
who are
thing.
bent on destroying the entire world through
Hey
a global
everybody,
conspiracy
dating
like
lounge.
this French language
Discord.gg
piece of
/
Nazi
e-dating.
propaganda that shows
Hi,
the Jew as some
hi.
kind of like
How did you
vicious
guys meet?
tarantula
Oh, we met
straddling the globe.
people.
Or
We met
here's
at Shul.
something
How about
from
you
the,
two? Oh,
the
we had a
Warsaw
matchmaker.
ghetto
Oh, really?
that
How about you
shows that
two?
the Jews carry
we
typhus
met
and are
on
associated with this deadly
Discord.gg
disease
/
and so on.
e-dating. Oh, of
So,
course. Of
and here
fucking course.
finally,
Why
here's
the
an
hell do I
Austrian
think
example.
they're-
This is just terrifying.
Hey everybody.
Again, from
This
the elections
is
of
the
that
worst
early interwar period,
shit you've
Jew was
ever
portrayed as some
seen.
kind of
No
like
one's ever
devilish
seen something
snake
so
who
bad
was
as this.
strangling
The worst
Austrian
stream ever.
people.
The worst.
image
I remember
reads
this
in
one
German,
time, kids.
Deutsche
I really
Christen
mean this.
rettet
I was
Österreich,
watching
which means German
absolute
Christians,
dog shit, and it was better than this.
save
I was like,
Austria,
wow, I am
right?
literally
You
just
have to
watching
vote for a particular political
excrement
party in order to
from a
save
fucking
Austria from
dog on
this
the
Jewish snake, who, by the way, is associated with the communists, because you can see the hammer and sickle are lying underneath there. So that's the kind of
And this shit?
atmosphere that Hitler came
Oh,
of
you're
age
fucked.
in. Now, here's
this shit,
an
dog?
image of Hitler as a baby, kind of a chilling image to look at.
dude. You don't gain
Hitler had a
fucking
difficult
points when you're
relationship with
deafened,
his
asshole.
father, who was
Everybody
much
knows
older
that.
than his mother.
Dog.
When his father passed away at 18, that allowed
Dog.
Hitler himself a little bit more freedom, because he
Dog.
always wanted to be an artist.
This
He
shit,
had some
you're
middling talent. Here
Oh.
you can see some of his artwork that's
Dog,
actually
look at this move.
available on the
Did anybody
web.
just see this move?
Unfortunately for the young
Don't
Adolf,
deafen.
he was not especially talented, and he was rejected
Oh,
from
now it's gonna
the
be like that?
School of Art. A rejection that stung him bitterly, and in fact, he complained about it in his memoirs later. And he always felt that
Dog,
somehow
what?
his rightful place in the Vienna School of Art was
This is
taken
the
by
dumbest
a Jewish applicant, and this idea of the replacement theory.
Bitch, shut the
meaning
fuck
that
up.
Hitler
No one
felt
gives
he
a
should
shit.
have been in the Vienna School of Art. but
This
a
is
Jew
the
had
worst
replaced
fucking
him. A Jew had,
shit ever
supplanted his
in the
rightful
history
place
of
in the
mankind.
incoming
Got it.
student
Fuck it.
body. That's something that, by the way, reverberates
How about
throughout a
this?
lot of nationalist, white supremacist
about
thought, right up
Simcha
into
Fox?
America in the early 21st century.
Damn, girl.
At any rate, he found
you?
new purpose with the onset of World War I, and he
Russian slut.
joined
Good on
it
you, girl.
enthusiastically. And he was actually wounded during World War I. He was the victim of a gas attack, which gas was used at that time, as we discussed in the previous lecture. But when Germany surrendered in November 1918, he, like many other Germans, felt that this was a stab in the back that was somehow orchestrated by Jews. Here you can see another Austrian propaganda cartoon that captures the idea of the stab in the back, which in German was just the Durchstoß. You can see and by the way, I'm using some Austrian materials here. We should mention that Hitler himself was actually an Austrian. Austria and Germany, although they are separate countries, they are really in one larger cultural unit. Austria would join with Germany in the Anschluss, and they would prosecute the war together, but that's for later on. At any rate, here is an Austrian depiction of the the anger that
Rabbi
many
Rothschild
Austrians
rules
felt
is 1
over
minute.
the
Reaction bot has 0
surrender in
minutes.
World War One. There's the
Hey,
lantern-jawed
River,
Austrian soldier with a
0 minutes.
steely
And later,
gaze,
1:03. This bitch
defending
never
the
reads.
Western Front, and sneaking up behind
Most
him is this
active
hideous-looking woman that
How am
has
I not the most
a
active
Jewish
How
star
is it
on the
anybody
French-style
else?
hat that she is wearing, and with this
No one
leering
knows,
smile,
but
she's
John
stabbing
Robert,
him in the back, meaning that the Jews somehow
0117,
betrayed Germany and Austria from within, causing a lot of anti-war sentiment and causing the Germans
Okay, you
to
done though? Everybody wants to know. Are
surrender
you done? 'Cause this
prematurely
is the worst.
before they could have actually
Hey, everybody.
won in World War One. Hitler, when he came back from the war, got very much involved in right-wing politics. He participated in the beer hall putsch, in which there was actually an attempted insurrection for which he was arrested and sent to jail. Here is a picture of him, believe it or not, in jail. He actually had a very cushy time there. The judge who sentenced him was clearly very sympathetic to Hitler's aims, and although he could not let him off scot-free, he gave him a very, very light sentence in jail, very brief duration, and allowed him a personal chef, all kinds of ridiculous things. And it was in jail that his reputation was secured. He got, credibility for having gone to jail for his right-wing beliefs. And while he was there, he wrote his memoir, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he essentially laid out his political program. It's a rambling, frequently incoherent document that lists all of his anti-Semitic complaints and his ambitions for Germany and so on. And essentially, this gave him, when he was released from prison, a lot more popularity. He used these thugs that were organized in the so-called brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung, to intimidate much of the population in the various elections that were held in the 1920s and 1930s, but he never gained a majority of the vote with his Nazi party. Here you can see the elections of 1928. He only got 2.6% of the popular vote. He got actually quite a bit more in 1930 and 1932. His primary opponents were really the Communist Party. In March 1933, he garnered 33%. With a lot of dirty tricks, but ultimately, when you look at the comparison with the other parties, you can see the Communists lost quite a bit in that last election. The Social Democratic Party, the second largest, only had 20% of the vote. So in the coalition-style government that was prominent in many European countries at the time, Hitler was given the opportunity as the leader of the largest single party, the plurality, to form a government, and that's when he was able to come to power. He proceeded early on to identify Jews with the so-called Nuremberg Law that clearly identified them by racial characteristics, that is, how much blood was in them as measured by their grandparents, creating a very racist society that was dependent for all kinds of advancement in various careers and in public services like education and so on whether or not one was free of any taint of Jewish blood. Jews were removed from civil service, from the courts, from education, and a whole series of measures were put in place to gradually push them out of German society. This culminated in a dramatic attack, the largest attack of its kind, called Kristallnacht in 1938, where there were it was really a nationwide pogrom against Jews, a widespread attack, widespread burning of synagogues. The name itself, Kristallnacht, comes from the broken glass that littered the streets of German cities. And it was kind of like the last warning for the Jews of Germany that they had better get out. The difficulty was that although many Jews were really quite willing to leave Germany, and a large number of them did, there were very few countries who would actually accept them at that time, as immigration quotas were imposed and fewer Jews were able to find safe haven elsewhere. So we're going to continue with the onset of World War II and the Holocaust in the next lecture. Thank you very much for watching.
Now you can step into it.
The war broke
That
out
was
on
fucking
September
amazing.
1st, 1939. This followed the secret pact that was signed by the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of non-aggression, which essentially allowed Germany and Russia to invade Poland and the Baltic states from either side and to divide it between them. We're going to focus our remarks on the region that was conquered first by the Germans, and then later on in the next video, we'll discuss a little bit the nature of the 2 years that Jews experienced under Soviets. The first encounter that the Jews of Poland and the Baltics in particular had with Third Reich soldiers was primarily through these ritual humiliations that they endured, often photographed and sent home to relatives and loved ones back in Germany. But it did not seem clear that the Nazis really had a solid plan for what they were going to do with the Jews of Eastern Europe. While the Nazis had planned in advance their military advance into Poland, it does not seem that they had clearly thought out what they were going to do with the Jewish population, more than 3 million of whom lived in Poland itself. But it seemed clear that they certainly wanted to expel them from the regions that immediately bordered Germany, 2 parts east. And so they created this section called the General Government, here shown in Polish. It's the green area. It was expanded after 1941 to include the Galicia district towards the bottom right of this map. At any rate, it seems that they pushed a lot of Jews into this general government in particular. And for Jews throughout the region, they began to collect them in ghettos. Now, the politics of ghettos was hotly debated among the Nazis. There are actually many voices that suggested that ghettos were not a good idea, that it would increase disease, that it would allow for greater possibilities of resistance and so on. But ultimately, a network of ghettos was established throughout the region that the Nazis had conquered. Some of those ghettos were closed, that is, they were sealed up with walls that were frequently created by the Jews themselves at Nazi orders. Other ghettos were technically open, that is, Jews could simply walk out of them, but then they would be exposed to the local population, which would frequently denounce them, blackmailing them for funds, and often they were at severe risk of being murdered by Nazi soldiers. The organization of the ghetto, however, was extremely important. When the Nazis came into the regions that they took over, they frequently went to the legitimate authorities that represented the Jewish community prior to the war. And they would go to essentially the president of the Kehillah or the Federation, to use a modern term. And they would say, all right, we would like the following things from the community now, a list of names and addresses and so on. We would like to requisition funds and any valuables and so on. And typically, the leaders of the Kehillah, the local Jewish elected leaders, would refuse, and they would be shot on the spot. The Nazis would then turn to a second generation, like vice presidents and treasurers, and put the same demands to them. If they refused, they would also be shot. And at some point, they would eventually get a local Jewish leadership, which they called the Judenrat, or the Jewish Council. And the Jewish Council ended up becoming kind of like the go-between of the Nazi demands on the Jewish population, right up until the ultimate destruction of the ghetto itself. Some of those Judenrat leaders were really quite heroic in their attempts to protect the Jews. Adam Czerniak, shown here, who was the leader of the Judenrat in Warsaw, he left behind a diary in which he meticulously related the weather and a lot of his personal concerns. He was very worried about the fate of his son, who was missing, and so on. But he describes in excruciating detail the slowly compressing fist that the Nazis held around the Jewish population, and the way in which he tried to appease them without inflicting too much harm on the people as a whole. Ultimately, by 1942, when it was clear that the Nazis intended to destroy the entire population, he committed suicide by swallowing cyanide. Other Judenrat leaders, such as Chaim Rumkowski, however, were widely regarded by the Jewish population as villains who sought to aggrandize themselves at the cost of the suffering of the larger population. Here is some currency printed in the Litzmannstadt ghetto by Rumkowski himself, which portrayed him as some kind of like redemptionist, messianic-like figure. He was frequently derided in the local population as King Chaim for the way in which he lorded over the population. And it seems that the Nazis had not clearly articulated what they even wanted to do with these ghettos. In some places, like in Łódź, which was run by Rumkowski, it seemed that the model was productionist, meaning there was a purpose for having the Jews in these ghettos that was somehow related to their utility for the war effort. And Łódź was a major textile center, and Jews there were put to work creating, uniforms for Nazi soldiers and linings and things like that. And so having a work permit was essentially a lifeline for the Jews of Łódź, and somehow the ghetto sort of made sense as a type of center for slave labor. On the other hand, other ghettos like Warsaw, where Adam Czerniako was active, seemed to be attritionist in nature, meaning the whole point of the ghetto was simply to have the Jews starve to death, and very few provisions were provided to them, and the Jews were reduced to either dying of starvation or of typhus, or of being shot, particularly children, for attempting to smuggle in goods from outside the walls. Order was maintained, or a semblance of order was maintained in the ghetto by the so-called Jewish police, who were set up by the Judenrat and were hated by the local population for their enforcement of Nazi objectives. There's a tremendous amount to say about the nature of life in the ghettos, which extended from the beginning of the war in 1939 through the dissolution of the ghettos in 1942. The primary characteristic of the ghetto experience was that of starvation and privation and mass death. But there were also some heroic internal activities, such as in Warsaw, the creation of underground medical schools and theatrical performances and lending libraries, and really an incredible array of activity that the Jews engaged in the ghetto to try and return the semblance of normalcy to their existence, even under these unimaginable conditions. There was also, unfortunately, a very active black market, and even activities like nightclubs and so on. A tremendous amount of gambling, prostitution, and organized crime happening in the ghetto as certain individuals took advantage of the suffering of the population as a whole. Ultimately, nothing would matter because all of these ghettos, whether they were productionists, whether they were attritionist, whether they strove to meet the needs of the Nazis or the demands of the Nazis, I should say, or whether they tried to resist, they were all destined for destruction. There were notable episodes of resistance in the ghettos. Perhaps the most famous is that of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, the uprising that occurred in April of 1943. Just by that date, however, you get a sense of the fact that the resistance happened really quite late. The ghetto was largely emptied of its Jews in the summer of 1942, and it was only a small remnant that chose to heroically, albeit symbolically, fight against the Nazis. On the other hand, there are other ways of looking at resistance in the ghetto that affirmed life without necessarily taking up arms against the Nazis. One great example of that is the spiritual resistance that was organized by Rabbi Kalonimus Kalmish Shapiro, shown here, known as the Eish Kodesh, a rabbi who continued to be active throughout the entire period in Warsaw, organizing clandestine gatherings of Jews to hear Hasidic philosophy and giving Jews strength under these unimaginable conditions. In 1942, however, the Nazis moved to a new phase of the murder process, and which will involve the death camps. And it is to that we will turn next in this series.
What the fuck is this?
Thank you very much for
shit?
watching.
Oh, dog. I am so pissed. I can't see straight, kids. Why? Because this shit sucks. Are you going to watch Kill Tony? Oh, damn. This girl.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. Welcome to another lecture in the Jewish History Lab series. We are now continuing our discussion of the Holocaust. These lectures are intended for educational purposes only. One of the historiographic challenges of studying the Holocaust is defining precisely what is it that we mean when we're speaking about the Holocaust. Are we talking about the overall period of persecution that the Jews suffered through, as well as other peoples during the reign of terror of Adolf Hitler? That could easily take us back into the early 1930s. Or are we speaking about something more narrowly focused, like the persecutions that came along with the invasion of Poland in September 1939? That's also quite a reasonable possibility. But the Holocaust and World War II are overlapping and not identical phenomena. Coming to the core of the events which we associate with the Holocaust involve two major periods of Nazi activity. The period of the Einsatzgruppen and the period of the death camps. This is the era in which the Nazis enacted actual mass murders, as opposed to the horrific conditions that were endured by Jews during the period of the ghettos. So let us look at those two moments in particular. We recall that one of the prerequisites of the beginning of hostilities in September 1939 is the sealing of a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, which allowed both Stalin and Hitler to invade Poland and the Baltic states and simply divide up the territory between them. That meant that a significant number of Jews found themselves inside the Soviet orbit between 1939 and 1941. I have a longer lecture on that topic specifically in a different series. See my YouTube channel on the Holocaust for a longer discussion of what happened there. But basically, Jews there, like the surrounding people, were subjected to rapid communization, collectivization of farms, arrest of intelligentsia, and so on. The Holocaust per se really begins, in my humble opinion, with the end of that Soviet period on June 22nd, 1941, with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, which was the Third Reich's double crossing of the Soviet Union, abrogating that non-aggression pact, as Hitler surprised Stalin with a massive, rapid advance into Soviet territory. Now, why that is specifically connected to the Holocaust is because behind the Wehrmacht troops, behind the regular army that were sent in to defeat the Soviet Union, Hitler sent 4 mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. And as you can see in this map here, these 4 squads spread out throughout the territory that they conquered in the Soviet Union. And their task was not to prosecute the war against the Soviets, but to prosecute Hitler's war against the Jews. They would go into the local villages known as Städtlach, little Jewish townlets that dotted the countryside, round up the local Jewish population, along with other enemies of Hitler, such as communist leaders. The Einsatzgruppen would march these Jews and others out to local ravines. If there were no dry riverbeds in the vicinity, they would have the Jews dig their own graves, and then they would simply shoot them by firing squad. This is sometimes called the Holocaust by bullets, because it represented a remarkably large number of casualties, civilian casualties of the war. Estimates range from 1.5 to 2.5 million Jews were killed during this process. And here you can see a map from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that gives you a sense of the scope of the townlets that were attacked in this nature. Kiev, which was not a town but rather a large city, had one of the largest of these mass killings. 33,000 Jews killed in the space of 2 days. The ravine called Babi Yar was used for a much larger number of Ukrainians and other opponents of the Third Reich for coming months. The so-called Holocaust by bullets, however, proved to be a very inefficient and psychologically a very taxing form of mass murder. And so the Nazis looked to a new way to rid themselves of their Jewish problem, so to speak. This was discussed at an important conference that took place at a resort at Wannsee on January 20th, 1942. Note the rather late date. You know, the war began in 1939. Operation Barbarossa, which represents the first mass killings of Jews. You know, the only thing that comes close to it before that would have been Kristallnacht in 1938, which had about 260 Jews killed. Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands, even millions of Jews killed in Barbarossa. But that was not fast enough, and it proved to be too hard on the psychological makeup of the soldiers who were engaged in these killing squads. So at Wannsee, this conference, which was chaired by Adolf Eichmann, shown here, they drew up a list of all of the Jews in Europe, a terrifying list, in my humble opinion, perhaps the most terrifying document that survived the German archives of the period. And you can see from this list of countries that it included countries that had not yet even been conquered by Germany, such as, for example, the United Kingdom, and it included even 200 Jews living in Albania, giving you a sense of just how determined the Nazis were to hunt down every last Jew of Europe. They counted up 11 million Jews, and from the Wannsee conference, it appeared that they intended to massacre all of them. The means to be used was gas poisoning, which they had already been experimenting with for some time. Chelmno was one of the regions where a gas chamber was constructed in order to see if they could scale this up. And in fact, the Nazis committed themselves to do so at that Wannsee conference. Here is a map that shows you the 6 so-called extermination camps. I personally don't like that term. The German term was Vernichtungslager, which means make into nothing camps, or destruction camps, or perhaps most simply death camps. These 6 death camps, Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, and Auschwitz, were situated in and around the General Gouvernement, which still had a very large concentration of Jews in the ghettos that we discussed in the previous video. And they were very different in terms of camps from the concentration camps, which Hitler had set up from the early 1930s. Unlike the concentration camps, which held largely non-Jews, particularly in the early period, they're political enemies of Hitler, the concentration camps were horrific, awful places with a significant death rate of people dying from things like starvation and abuse, but they were nothing like the death camps. The death camps were intended primarily for the purpose of creating death. They were factories of death. Many of them had satellite camps that were used for slave labor, but it only represented a very small proportion of the Jews who were interned in these death camps. Here you get a sense of the process of the deportations from all around Europe, including regions that were conquered nearly at the very end of the war, when it was clear that Nazis were going to lose World War II. Places like northern Italy and Hungary, Jews were deported there in a last-ditch attempt to murder as many Jews as possible. What was the process? Jews were rounded up and placed on cattle cars, some 6,000 a day leaving Warsaw, and then when they disembarked, often after a terrifying and horrific long journey from places as far away as Paris, where many of whom had died actually en route, they disembarked and they were subject to selection, where those small numbers of Jews who were deemed to be healthy enough to work in the slave labor camp were isolated and sent away to those satellite camps. The vast majority of the rest of Jews were shorn of anything that could possibly be of value on their persons, not only their personal belongings, but also their prosthetic limbs, eyeglasses, gold teeth. Even their hair was taken from them, and then they were sent to these gas chambers where they were made to think they were being sent to be deloused, to have lice removed from their bodies. This was very common in many of these camps. Even the Americans later would use DDT to try and remove lice from troops and from prisoners. But in reality, the gas that was used was Zyklon B, a rat poison that was poured in typically through the roof. And then Jews were exposed to it and died within 20 or 30 minutes of horrible asphyxiation. Then bodies were sent to crematoria in an attempt to get rid of the huge number of corpses, perhaps 1,500 a day in Auschwitz that would pile up. The crematoria, however, were very inefficient, and frequently the bodies simply had to be burned out in open air. Those small number of Jews who were sent for slave labor were sent to live in barracks and labor under unimaginable conditions. The vast majority of them died within a very short period of time because they were considered disposable. But those Jews who survived the Holocaust in these camps were typically the Jews who were not immediately processed for gassing, but rather managed to live because they were sent for slave labor. Other Jews were selected for medical experimentation, horribly cruel, genetic experiments were conducted on children in particular if they were identical twins. In the end, when they liberated the camps, they found a small number of emaciated Jews who had just barely survived the war. This is one of the most horrific chapters in Jewish history, perhaps in world history. Thank you very much for watching.
Nobody cares about the beautiful things.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I hope you are well. I am really excited today. I have a piece of important news that is a significant milestone in my life, and I'm hoping it will also have a positive impact on yours as well. And those of you who have been with the channel for a while know that just before the pandemic, I signed a contract with a fantastic publisher, Koren Publishers in Jerusalem, to produce a 3-volume history of the Jewish people from earliest times to the present day. My goal was to create something that will be dignified yet affordable, and it will be the perfect bar mitzvah gift for the next century. That's my goal. I think it's going to be a really useful project. And the news for all of us today is that this very day, I'm sending the manuscript to the publisher for the first volume. This is in fact what it looks like. I've been working on it since the beginning of the pandemic. A few months before is when I really got started. And I'm just really pleased to reach this particular milestone. I want to take a minute in this video to tell you a little bit about how you can be involved if you haven't been already. First of all, the really different thing that I think I tried with this particular volume, and I think it's been successful, is I crowdsourced a certain amount of the research by sketching out the chapters in a series of about 100 odd videos, which I call Jewish History Lab. I've added a few other series as well since then, and I'm really pleased to say that it's gotten a big response. There have been 9.2 million views on the channel, which is a mind-boggling number, about 75,000 subscribers, and 300 channel members who get involved in a much deeper level. But here's the part that's specifically connected to the book. I created a biblical Jewish history course where I could put all of the videos and organize them so that, because my channel does tend to get a little bit confusing when I work on different projects, I put the videos in sequence and by relevancy, and then I added the draft chapters as we went along. So far, 120 students have gone through the Biblical Jewish History course, and in this particular course, I've gotten the best feedback ever. Really, really useful stuff. I'm so grateful to you for telling me a little bit about how I might shape this particular book, and it's been fantastic. If you are interested in participating in the Biblical Jewish History course yourself, welcome. It would be great to have you there. I'll put the links in the information section. So if you are interested in reading this draft text and giving me some suggestions as to how I might, shape it one way or another, or you'd like to read what other people think and maybe engage in a little bit of community interaction, if you like, it's entirely open to you. We would love to have you. Okay, I have to get started on volume 2 right now. And I want to thank you so much for helping me out as I put together volume 1. Enjoy the videos, and I hope you have a really good day. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I'm really excited to be beginning the Jewish History Lab series again with you. And you may be wondering, especially if you have been binge watching the Jewish History Lab, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be going more into the modern period? What are we doing here in the Dark Ages? Well, there's actually a really good reason. As you will recall, the whole point of this Jewish History Lab series is to help me sort of sketch out what I wanted to say in this major book that I'm writing for Koren Publishers in Jerusalem. It's a 3-volume survey of Jewish history. And just yesterday, I'm so pleased, I finally sent the manuscript of Volume 1 off to the editors there to start working their magic on it. And I'm hoping that in about a year or so, it'll be available in print. And now I'm working on Volume 2. This morning I got up early, started writing Volume 2. And of course, it's dealing with the medieval period. So I want to go back to this format of sketching out my lectures, a little bit more fleshed out than we may have discussed in the first time we went through this. And well, I hope you don't mind. Okay, let's talk now about the question of, was there a Jewish Dark Age? First of all, what does that term Dark Age actually mean? It comes primarily from 18th and 19th century European historiography, which posits a map that looks something like this. If you look at the y-axis, that's basically measuring like civilization. Up high, you have like advanced and literary civilization, all kinds of arts and things like that, sciences, and at the bottom you have very little. And the x-axis represents time flowing from left to right. This philosophical model of history basically posits that you have in the Greco-Roman period this huge flourishing of civilization. That's represented here in the work of Raffaella, the Scuola di Atene, the School of Athens, that shows all of these philosophers standing around in this gorgeous facility with domes and with, all kinds of anachronistic devices, but nevertheless, it's like a big intellectual party where everyone's having this symposium-like atmosphere of discussing high ideas. Right in the center, of course, is Aristotle and Plato. Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right, and below them on the steps is Socrates. There's a whole story to that, but not for now. And this civilization represents like a peak in human attainments and achievements, let's say in the 5th and 4th century before the Common Era. Then you begin to go into a period of decline that is especially marked by the fall of Rome. Here's a 19th century Russian rendition of what that must have looked like. Rome was sacked several times in the 400s. This one is kind of interesting because you see on the center right, there's the menorah represented here being taken away from the Temple of Jupiter, where it had laid since the conquest of the province of Judea in the year 70. And so the fall of Rome represents the end of that glorious civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization. And then you go into this period called the Dark Ages, which is characterized by, according to this model, lack of literacy and culture and arts and things like that. There's still some pretty fascinating things going on, but generally it's not nearly the level of attainments that you have in the Greco-Roman period. Then there's this amazing rebirth, which is called, of course, the Renaissance. That's what the term rebirth means, which occurs in the mid-1300s and onward. The classic architectural demonstration of that is this building, the Duomo in Florence, which is such a remarkable representation of the Renaissance, because when they first built this facility, they wanted to build a dome on the top, which kind of, echoed their imagination of what it must have been like in Greece and Rome, but nobody knew how to build it on an engineering level. How do you create a dome across a gap of 140 feet? So they left the building blank as they were constructing it, saying, figuring one day someone will figure this out. This is like a tremendous chutzpah, architectural chutzpah, and of course someone came along, figured out the technology, and then it was hugely influential. You see this kind of dome echoed in Rome and even in Washington and all kinds of places where you have it. So that's the Renaissance. If we look at this graphically, you put these together and you see that the model of Dark Ages is that it goes from a height in the Greco-Roman period down into the depths of culture in the so-called Dark Ages, and then rises up again in the Renaissance and just theoretically keeps going up and up and up. So that's basically this term Dark Ages, the period where Europe went dark, that we didn't have nearly as much culture and literacy and things like that. And it's also called the Middle Ages because it's in the middle of these two peaks, right? It's a valley in the middle of these two peaks. So that's basically the model. It is very Christian and Eurocentric, and it basically denies the kind of cultural activities that are happening elsewhere in the world, in particular places like the Middle East and East Asia and so on. So here's our question for today. Was there a Jewish Dark Age? I mean, after all, the Jews are heavily involved in all of these cultures. Did they experience this same drop-off? So first of all, let's just think for a second about the theological approach to time. And there's so much to say about this, but just very briefly, if we put on the same scale, the y-axis being culture, civilization, and so on the x-axis, you put time. So you begin with Moses right up here. I always love this kind of picture. I saw the 10 Commandments when I was about, 8 years old, and it has a huge impact on me. I always sort of, it's too bad it poisoned my mind. I can never think of Moses as anyone other than Charlton Heston. But anyways, there you go. And then what happens after this supreme moment of closeness to God, of the revelation at Sinai, when every Jew actually heard the first 2 commandments uttered by the voice of God, wow, overwhelming. How can you get any closer to developing than that? And from that point on, it's just a steady downhill. There's nowhere to go from that peak. And so this is called Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations, that at least on the level of spirituality, the world must go into a period of decay, because how can you get any closer to God than that particular moment? But this is not a historical model. This is like a spiritual kind of mental model of theological structure of the universe. How does it work in terms of history? So it depends a lot, obviously, on what you measure. If we go back to our chart again and we say at the very bottom, politically, you have the fall of the Judean political entity at the hands of the Romans, the destruction of the temple, the fall of Masada, shown here in 74, and Jews go into a period of political wandering where, if everything worked by natural law, you would think that these people would simply disappear. But nevertheless, what they end up doing is they focus deeply on cultural literacy. The Mishnah travels with the Jews outside of the land of Israel in their 2,000-year exile, and that turns out to be a phenomenal catalyst for spiritual, cultural civilization development. You have tremendous figures. I'm just going to pick a few, like Chasta ibn Shaprut. Here's a Spanish language novel about this tremendous Spanish courtier. You have the great Maimonides. I mean, we're talking about tremendous achievements in culture. When most of Europe was still living at a very low cultural level, the Jews were actually increasing the level of culture. So it's hard to say that they had anything like a dark age, that in reality, the trajectory was definitely upward. So can we use that same model? So that's really what we're going to study for the next several weeks as we look at this Middle Ages, trying to understand when the trajectory of Jewish culture and civilization mirrored that of the decline after Rome, and where, as in many places, we see that culture actually expanding and developing. So to answer the question we began with, I think it's really hard to speak of a Jewish dark age in the sense of a huge lull in Jewish creative cultural activity. It really goes pretty much constantly through many of these periods. There may be a few centuries where Jewish history goes dark in the sense that we simply don't have any data on what was happening with Jews living in this place or in that sphere. I think the Visigothic schemane comes to mind, for example, that we don't know what was going on in the Jewish community, but the overall trajectory is definitely positive in nature, and that speaks to the stubborn resistance of the Jewish people to simply disappear from the world stage. They continue to develop their culture, their civilization, their literary works, and really it's a fascinating story. I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Thank you very much for watching. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I'd like to continue our discussion of Jewish civilization now at the beginning of the so-called medieval period or Dark Ages with a look at the Jews of the land of Israel. Now, let's understand the role of geography in the development of the Jewish people. Have a look at this amazing map by Heinrich Bunting. This is a 16th century map. He called it the cloverleaf map. He was a fascinating kind of individual. He liked to make these kind of map ideas that expressed like more philosophical thought about how the world was organized. And this is one of my favorites. And it shows in this cloverleaf, the top left is Europe, the top right is Asia, and the bottom is Africa. Of course, these three continents. And they all join in the land of Israel, which is featured at the center with Jerusalem there. Now, this is not a Jewish map, obviously. You can see the three crosses there. Bunting himself was a Protestant minister, not especially successful in his career as a minister, but really successful, I think, as a map maker. You can see America, the New World, is off to the left there, and there's a whole bunch of mermaids and sea monsters and things like that. Now, Israel, of course, is right at the center of three continents. And in fact, when you look at Israel from a satellite map, you can see that it's basically true. Africa connects to Europe and Asia through the land of Israel, and the note that this is exacerbated by the Jordan River Valley Rift, which is very prominent in the satellite photograph. Basically, to the right, to the east of that Jordan River Valley, it's like an impassable desert. So basically, if you want to go anywhere from, let's say, the very rich agricultural area of the Nile Delta in Egypt, which you can see just to the left of the land of Israel there, up to the region of Mesopotamia, which would be on the extreme right towards the middle, that green area there. The only way to get from A to B is through Israel. That's called the Fertile Crescent, by the way. That's a sort of C shape that's formed from Egypt through Israel and then down into Mesopotamia. And Israel really is at the crossroads. There's no other way by land to get between these three continents, so Bunting himself was not so far off. The roads developed this way from ancient times. Here's a map showing the roads from, on the bottom left, Egypt to the middle right, the Fertile Crescent, and they have to go through the land of Israel. There were two major routes. One is called the Derech Hayam, the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, which basically hugs the coast about halfway up the land of Israel and then cuts to the east. And then there was the Derech HaMelech, the King's Highway, later transplanted here to the holy city of Brooklyn, New York, where it skirted under the Dead Sea and then made its way up the eastern part of the Jordan River Valley. This is kind of like the turnpike version, where there are maybe more tolls, but it's a faster highway, right? Less scenic, of course, but nevertheless a faster highway. Everything goes through Israel. There's no roads really to the east. It's true, you can do a camel caravan, dangerous, expensive, all kinds of robbers and brigands on the way. The much easier way is to travel through Israel. So Israel really was at a crossroads, geographically, economically, and that was the case for thousands of years. It's important to note, of course, that not only goods travel up and down this tiny strip of land, but also ideas, right? We have all kinds of thought traveling, notions from Mesopotamia, notions from Egypt, those notions from further afield as they make their way to this region. So more to say about that later. Now, how would people have seen it in the early Dark Ages? Let's have a look at this fascinating map called the Madaba map, which is located in Madaba in Jordan. It's also pronounced Mudba in Hebrew, but in Arabic it is Madaba. Here is the map itself, which was made originally as a mosaic of a church in the 6th century of the Common Era. It's a Byzantine church, and it was covered over. The church itself was abandoned when there was some earthquakes in the 8th century, and it was eventually resettled, and they covered it over with tiles, which were discovered again during an 1884 renovation of the region. It's partially damaged and obscured by the pillars and things like that, but we get a much better look at this fragmentary map.
This is awful.
Reconstruction here. It's absolutely gorgeous and amazing. It's obviously designed for Christian pilgrims coming to the Holy Land. They're coming from points east, and they stop in this church, and they get oriented as to what's going on in the land of Israel. What should they look for? Now, like many ancient maps, it is oriented with east to the north, right? So you have to imagine, as we're looking at this map, the south of the map, or let's say the bottom of the map, you're like standing with your feet in the Mediterranean Ocean, and you're looking towards the east. And that big sort of blob in the middle is the Dead Sea. To the left of it, the Jordan River flows into it, and all through the map there are various sites of Christian significance that are mentioned in Christian scriptures and things like that. So visitors will be able to, tour these sites and understand something about where they're located from this map. Here's a beautiful depiction of the holy city of Jerusalem.
What is
See
this?
that this mosaic, which by the way has literally millions of tiles over
They have
140
another
square
debate
feet,
somewhere?
and it
What
says
is
at the
this?
top
Why
there
do I know
is
about that and not the fucking debate?
Hagia
What in the
Polis
fuck is this?
Jerusa.
Free and
The last part is cut off, but the holy
Free
city of Jerusalem.
equal elections
It
presidential.
is. You
What
can
the fuck is
clearly
that?
see the
Free
original
equal-
design of Jerusalem. Running through the center is the Roman road known as the Cardo. I actually have personal experience with the Cardo because when I was a young undergraduate at Hebrew University, I worked at Richie's Cardo Cafe, which was actually a pizza joint right on the Cardo there. To the left would be the Damascus Gate, and it's actually laid out with pretty specific proportions and very accurate.
Loomis,
what
shout out
archaeologists
to
have been able
Loomis.
to reconstruct about it.
Shout out
So
there,
here you get the
Dave.
idea of Israel still as a great center, a focus of
This shit is
pilgrimage
the
for
worst.
Christians, of course, holy to Jews who are still living in the land of Israel. Of course, we're going to continue with that in another lecture. But this region eventually is conquered by the Muslims in the 7th century as Islam sweeps through the region. And of course, that will be the subject of much of our discussion as well.
Shit.
Just one last detail, though, before we leave this map and the Muslims. This is a fascinating picture. This is a close-up of the two fishermen on the Dead Sea. And as you can see, the boat is very clearly delineated. You can see the
What in
mast,
the
and there's
fuck?
like a furled up sail there. But
This
what's
is
going on with the fishermen
shit.
themselves? So it appears that the
Oh,
Muslims,
look at
when they
what-
encountered this Nadama map, they were
This
like
guy, fuck
hesitant to
you, dude.
destroy
Overworked
it.
if you move on my shit,
Obviously,
yeah.
it's a tremendous
Isn't that
work
the
of
world's
art
largest
and
PC
extremely
and
useful,
jump
but at the
set
same
without a
time,
fuck.
it depicts the human form, which was considered anathema to the Muslims in the 7th century in particular. And so what they did was they as it were,
Holy
vandalized
shit.
the map. They
I
removed
don't really
the
like it.
bodies and the faces of the fishermen, and they painstakingly
Seems like
recreated
all
the
this
mosaic
seems
with
like-
other tiles to
like
disguise
grass.
their original form. You can just see their hands and feet sticking out of those sort of potato-like shapes. So you see how the Muslims also left a
Thought
huge
that would
impact
be
on the
good
region,
as
which of course would be the subject of much of our discussion in the future. Okay, I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much for watching. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. Let's continue our discussion of the early Dark Ages, and let's look at the land of Israel and Babylonia simultaneously. Let's start a little bit with a review of the important political history. So here in the background is a beautiful image of the Beit Alpha mosaic. We're going to return to this in a little while. But what were the major political events between the year 200 and the year 634, specifically in the land of Israel? We've spoken quite a bit about the middle of the 2nd century, in the immediate aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and how Judea, the central southern part of the land of Israel especially, is attacked by Hadrian and his successors. Tremendous devastation wrought on Jerusalem in particular, and all kinds of terrible things. A lot of the Jewish population moves to the north, where there's a new center developing there. Then at the end of the century, there's a very brief moment of respite, largely as a result of this relationship between one of the Roman emperors, who is known in the Talmud as Antoninus, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself. This mysterious Antoninus is difficult to identify because Antonin was the name of an entire dynasty, and there's several emperors that had the name Antonin in their names, usually the second or third name, and so it's hard to determine which one it is, but most likely the one that's called Caracalla, because they had similar names, they often had nicknames. So during this period, when, according to the Talmud, actually the reason for their very close relationship was because at one point their mothers actually switched, and Antoninus was actually nursed by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's mother, and that experience changed him dramatically, although it is important to note that his father was also positively disposed towards Jews. At any rate, what this means for us is there's that moment in time when Yehuda Nasi decides that he's going to take advantage of it, and he specifically organized the codification of the Mishnah. The Roman Empire, of course, is going to be divided. You're going to have the western part ruled by Rome, the eastern part ruled by a place called Byzantium that would later be renamed after Emperor Constantine as Constantinople. Eventually, when the Muslims would conquer it, they would rename it Istanbul. This represents an eastern and a western Roman empires, and they're going to be quite different in so many ways. And in general, the Jews begin to experience a steady decline in their status after that brief moment of respite under Antoninus. There is a couple of punctuated moments where it seems to look a little bit better, like Julian the Apostate, a very short-lived leader of the Roman Empire in the middle of the 4th century, proposes to the Jews, quite possibly because he wants to get an alliance with the Jews of Babylonia. It didn't really work out, but he proposed even rebuilding the temple, which generated a certain amount of enthusiasm, but not enough to keep him from being killed on the battlefield, and that idea simply disappeared. By the way, the term apostate is something that's applied from a later Christian perspective, obviously, because he was bucking the trend towards Christianity that would be strongly promoted by his predecessor, Constantine. The Persians will end up invading, the Persians will get the upper hand over the Roman Empire, and they will end up invading the land of Israel in the year 614. And then the Eastern Roman Empire, now called the Byzantine Empire, will invade back again just a couple decades later, and then the Muslims will come in just 5 years later in the year 634 and kind of bookend this period that we're talking about. So we're looking at about 400 years now in just a couple of short lectures, but I hope this orients you to the overall picture of what's happening in the land of Israel. Perhaps one of the most important things for the long-term survival of the Jewish people is, of course, the development of the academies, the yeshivot. And we have two major centers. In the land of Israel, they're centered primarily in the north. This particular map is a little bit, I think, distorted in the sense that all the dots are the same size, and you get the sense there's yeshivas all over Israel, but really the most important ones, the concentration of the most significant figures were to the north. There were definitely significant figures in the south, in Lydda, for example, and the Talmud speaks about the Chachmei Darom, the sages of the south, but most of the activity is happening in the north. The two most significant figures after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi passed away were none other than the great Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, phenomenal thinkers of the late 3rd century, who were perhaps the most important in bringing together the texts for what would ultimately become the Jerusalem Talmud. They and their successors were involved in this, especially after yet another revolt, this one much more localized, against a local governor named Gallus in the year 351-52. After briefly gaining some momentum against the Romans, the Romans now having gone through two major wars against the Jews, not to mention a minor war in 115, they put it down almost immediately and in a terrifying manner, completely destroying the Jewish population of Sepphoris, for example. But it was against this backdrop, and perhaps because the Jews saw that moment that they had enjoyed under Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was perhaps going to close forever, that they decided to codify their lengthy discussions of the Mishnah into the first Talmud. Now, it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. This is something of a misnomer. Almost all of the activity was happening to the north. In fact, Jews were barely allowed in Jerusalem at all during this time. The other term that's frequently used is the Palestinian Talmud, which is certainly more accurate if you want to refer to the land of Israel as Palestine, but it also carries a somewhat strange distortion as well. So the Jerusalem Talmud is the Yerushalmi is the term that's most frequently cited in Hebrew at any rate. They don't use the term Palestinian Talmud in Hebrew. In English, you will see both of those terms. But the Talmud is basically a lengthy, almost like an edited transcript of the discussion of hundreds of rabbis of the Mishnah as it was recorded by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi at the turn of the 3rd century. Now, over in Babylonia, this is the period when you get the expansion of the great yeshivas there, which would ultimately eclipse the yeshivas in Israel. Pumbedita and Sura are perhaps the most significant of this period, and they end up writing the Babylonian Talmud, which is, of course, distinct from the Jerusalem. It's written afterwards. It encapsulates what they said in the Jerusalem Talmud, but they expand in other areas. Of course, they're able to look back and discuss it. And one of the most significant elements in creating this Talmud is the activity of the so-called nechute. The term nechute is Aramaic. It means those who go down. It's the same term used in Hebrew today as yordim for those who leave the land of Israel. Today it carries a slight tinge of derogatory tone sometimes. That's not necessarily used in the context of the Talmud, because there was actually a lot of commerce between the land of Israel and Mesopotamia. Jews were going back and forth all the time. Quite often, the Babylonian will start with a phrase like Ki asa Rav Dimi. When Rabbi Dimi came, i.e. from the land of Israel, and he said, hey, this is what they're saying in Israel, that really cross-fertilized ideas and was extremely important in creating this much larger Talmud. The Babylonian, which is essentially the one studied today. This is a period also when there is a major invasion of someone named Odenatus Septimus. He was the king of nearby Palmyra, known in the Talmud as Tadmor. This is a region that was allied with Rome and was actually kind of like a minor principality of sorts. And rather than showing Rome's strength, it actually showed Rome's weakness, that Rome could not really mount an effective attack on the Persian Empire, and so they had to rely on this proxy. But why it's important for us is that he ravaged much of the region where the Jews lived. He completely destroyed the yeshiva of Neharda in the year 259, which was right when it was at its peak under Shmuel. And a lot of things changed as a result of that particular event. It really resulted in the expansion of Pumbedita and so on, but that's maybe a little more detailed than me. But by the time we get to somewhere around the year 450, maybe a little bit later, the dates are not entirely clear, Rav Ashi and several others, Ravina, were involved in the closing of the Talmud, just as it happened in the land of Israel. So it happened also in Babylonia, where they brought together all of the texts that they had been discussing. They edited them. It was primarily an oral document, but then it was committed to writing, and that's ultimately what became the Babylonian Talmud. Now, I should mention that
what is this
Rav
bullshit?
Ashi cannot be the last person who signed off on the Talmud, because the Talmud has passages that refer to events after his death and question some of the things that he said. For example, after his
it's
passing.
just
So
awful.
it's more likely that
No,
Rav Ashi perhaps
just
formed the essence of it, and then later editors added a few things. But that's a whole other discussion, very active in the world of academic Talmud study. This Babylonian Talmud had tremendous implications for the rest of Jewish history. Perhaps its most significant modern development is the institution of something called Daf Yomi, which means literally a page a day or a folio a day. A daf is both sides of one page, and this is essentially the world's largest book club. It's been running since the 1920s, where Jews all over the world will follow a single calendar and will learn the same folio of Talmud on the same day worldwide. So you can study the Talmud, here in Brooklyn, get on a flight out of JFK and go to, Tokyo, and you can pick up the next daf in Tokyo the next day. And you can travel the world like this. It's a tremendous unifying feature. Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews are engaged in it daily. And I'm very proud, I'll put in a little plug here, for participating in something called Al Daf, which putting on the screen here. Al Daf is taking the whole Daf Yomi experience and putting it onto the internet. This is an app that allows you to choose from dozens of different Magidei Shir, people who teach the page of Talmud, in many languages, English, Hebrew, Yiddish, you name it. And then there's a whole bunch of other supplementary materials. The part that I do that I'm really happy about is I give a 2 to 5 minute lesson on some historical datum that occurs on that particular page of the Talmud. I'm really proud of it. Check it out. It's called Jewish History in the World. At the same time as all this is happening, we also have a tremendous culture of Babylonian Jews that's not really well known. I think one of the greatest illustrations of this is the discovery a while ago of about 1,500 of these things. They're called incantation bowls or curse bowls, and no one's exactly sure precisely how they were used, but they are clearly produced by Jews, perhaps for a general market, not just other Jews, but also for local Babylonians. They typically involve all kinds of spells, prayers. You can use different kinds of words to describe the tone of these things, sometimes featuring drawings like this one, sometimes demons. And they're often, they were discovered by archaeologists in place, and apparently they would be turned upside down as if to, capture evil spirits and keep them in the house contained, or perhaps to affect the spells that were written in Aramaic around the outside of the bowl. Sometimes they were broken, sometimes they were whole. Were they intentionally broken? Wow, so many questions. But this is just an example of the popular culture that we just don't know a lot about, and hopefully that will get more answers as the research continues. Okay, let's stop here. Thank you very much for watching.
Pumpkin spice latte bar recipe. King Arthur baking can kiss my ass. I love this thing.
Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. Let's pick up our discussion now of the history of the Jews in the land of Israel and in Babylonia in the early Middle Ages, the early Dark Ages, if you will. And I'd like to emphasize one thing that is among the many contributions that Jewish civilization has rendered to humanity as a whole. I've explored this in much greater detail in text. If God willing, you have a chance to look at the book, or you can look at the draft version of it in my course on biblical Jewish history. One of the, we've talked about several of these contributions that Jews made, Jewish civilization made to humanity. The Sabbath is a massive thing, right? The idea of having one day off in 7, a day of rest, a day that's dedicated to religious growth, the family connections, something that's way more important today than it ever has been, since we live in such a connected world where you have in your hand the electronic attachment to everything in the world. The Sabbath is a mandatory, like, calm down, focus on the people you live with, focus on your community, focus on your direct relationships with other people. Well, I want for a long time. Of course, prior to that, but connected to it, is the idea of monotheism. Very, very significant contribution to world culture, especially Western civilization. A smaller but very significant one that we should talk about today is the synagogue, which is essentially a gathering place, a local gathering place for the public communal worship of God, which was a new institution. Typically in the ancient world, you would have temples, which were manned by specialists like priests, who would be the only ones allowed into the center. The ancient temple in Jerusalem is similar in that, the actual work of the temple was only performed by Kohanim and Leviim. There are lots of other people who could kind of be on the outside, but the real stuff that happens there was for specialists. A synagogue is a public place. A synagogue is where everyone can go and can express their spiritual yearnings and be reinforced by a community engaged in the same kind of spiritual activity. Very, very important. It later, of course, morphs into the church and the mosque. These are the direct descendants of the synagogue. The very idea of the synagogue is something that we tie to the ancient Jewish world. Let's have a look at some of the archaeological record. Now, there's a lot of mystery about synagogues, about exactly when they started. There are some theories that say it goes all the way back, let's say, for example, to the Babylonian diaspora. The Talmud speaks about a very ancient synagogue there, established in the 6th century before the Common Era. And it stands to reason that you'd want to have synagogues when you are forcibly exiled from the temple, but not really definitive sources. We haven't found any remains of synagogues that date back that far. There's also a good argument to say that it's associated somehow with the rebellion of the Maccabees, when there was a big surge of enthusiasm for Judaism as a whole. And we see a lot of archaeological evidence of the development of more and more mikvaot across the lands of Israel, ritual baths and so on, the use of chalk vessels, which were important for the laws of purity and so on. And perhaps it's associated with that period. But the earliest actual archaeological evidence we have for synagogues is this document, the Theodotos inscription, which basically says that as long as there have been synagogues, there have been dedicatory plaques, right? Which I'm smiling because if you walked into a synagogue today, you would see they are filled with plaques. Shlomi dedicated the Aron, and Rivka dedicated the Kisei Shel Eliyahu to her father. And, this is something that Jews do in exchange for financial support for the community and the synagogue specifically. You put up a plaque that memorializes the donor. This is the Theodotos inscription, which was discovered just outside Jerusalem. And it dates, it's difficult to exactly place it because it was not in its original place. It was thrown into an empty cistern with a lot of construction debris. So it's hard to exactly date it, but it's probably from the 1st century before the Common Era, maybe as late as the 1st century of the Common Era, but it seems to be around the time when the temple was still standing. Here's the text. Theodotos, son of Vetenus, priest and head of the synagogue. The term here is used quite frequently in these dedications, archisynagogos, which is actually a term that is quite frequently applied to women. About 1/3 of the surviving inscriptions refer to women as being the head of the synagogue. Son of the head of the synagogue and grandson of a head of the synagogue, which sounds like that joke about the Kohanim, which indicates that, if this dates from, let's say, even a late date, let's say the year 50 of the Common Era, his father and his grandfather were also heads of something called the synagogue. So we can certainly place it, in the 1st century before the Common Era. And he built the synagogue for the reading of the law, right? Meaning that they would actually have public Torah readings in the synagogue, which still happens today. And by the way, we have, not archaeological remains, but literary remains. The Christian scriptures, for example, have descriptions of what's going on in the synagogue. It appears to be reading of the Haftorah, for example, and for the teaching of the commandments. So it's like an educational institution of some sort. as well as the guest room, the chambers, and the water fittings as an inn for those in need from abroad. So it appears that this synagogue, at any rate, had a more expansive purpose. It seems a little bit more like maybe a JCC hostel kind of area. It's fascinating. The synagogue which his fathers founded with the elders and Simonides. We have some examples of archaeological remains of ancient synagogues. Here's one that's absolutely fascinating to me. This is a little bit later, and it dates from the period that we are focused on. It's located in a place called Hamat Tiberia, the hot springs of Tiberias, which is in the north, and it dates from the 4th century. Now, if you look at this, this is an aerial view. There's some kind of like wall that was constructed that bisects, unfortunately, this gorgeous floor mosaic. And on top of it is this interesting kind of panel or register. Let's bring this up here. And it has 3 centuries after the destruction of the temple. It has all of these symbols hearkening back to the temple. Has a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. Has incense shovels, which would be unfamiliar to the Jews in the 4th century because this particular form of worship ended with the temple's destruction. It has, of course, a shofar blown on Rosh Hashanah and the menorah, a perennial symbol of Judaism. So they're still thinking of the synagogue as a mikdash ma'at, as a small sanctuary, some kind of like echo of the temple, which is the way Jews think of it even to this day. Looking at the zodiac that is in the floor, however, this is just bizarre, right? First of all, very beautiful artwork, very realistic, a high example of 4th century Byzantine art. And you see the 4 seasons around the outside. And you've got all of the, the 12 signs of the zodiac labeled in Hebrew. A certain amount of nudity, which is somehow shocking, but we also see it in the Dura Europos synagogue. I'll show you that later. Not necessarily the nudity, but the Dura Europos synagogue. But what's going on in the center there? You have what really looks like Helios, the sun god, which is a typical representation in non-Jewish zodiacs, where you have the 12 signs of the zodiac surrounding the sun god. How is this possible in a Jewish house of worship? And especially because for much of this period, Jews tended to be very aniconic, meaning when they portrayed artwork, it was typically decorative in nature using geometrical symbols and patterns rather than, depictions of the human form. So theories are still being developed as to what's going on here, but perhaps one of the most significant or more convincing theories is that Jews didn't look at this like it was the god Helios. They looked at it as if it was a representation of the sun. That's just the convention. When you want to display the sun, you display it like a guy sitting there with his face shining. And it's not like they took it seriously as, oh, there's Helios, the sun god. They would say, oh, isn't this a beautiful, you've got the sun and all these other things around it. You can be convinced or not, but if you have a better idea, put it in the comment box. Here is another example of a zodiac, not nearly as beautiful, I think, from the Beit Alpha synagogue. Dates a little bit later. You can see that the artwork is, I think, a little bit more primitive in nature, but very similar kind of decorative elements. And you see, of course, Helios with his 4 horses, and so we have multiple examples of this kind of convention. This is also a mosaic from Beit Alpha, which has a very, very stark kind of representation of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. You see that on the far right there is patriarch Abraham, and he's holding a slaughtering knife, and he's about to place his son Isaac, labeled in Hebrew, on the flames, and he's after slaughtering him. But there is in the center, towards the top, there is a hand that reaches out from heaven, which is also fascinating because, if Jews are traditionally aniconic and they don't like representing animals or humans as a result of the 10 Commandments, then they certainly don't represent God. But nevertheless, here it is. There's some question about who was the artist who produced this. Is it possible you have Christian artists who are doing this work? But if that's the case, I mean, the Jews are paying for this art for their synagogue, right? So how are they authorizing it? Lots of fascinating questions. At any rate, under the hand, it says in Hebrew, Al Tishlach, do not send out your hand against the boy, and so on. And you can see all kinds of things happen. Ayel, here's the ram that's tied to the bush, and so on. fascinating stuff.
Program.
I want to share with you one more synagogue, this time not in the land of Israel. This is the amazing synagogue of Duro Europos. This is a synagogue that was discovered in the 20th century in a city on the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. And the Romans, correctly fearing a Persian attack, decided to reinforce the city. They assumed, again correctly, that the Persians would not attack from the riverside, but they would go and swoop around the city and attack from the southwestern side. And so what they did was, if you look on the map here, they bury all of the city in sand, which was designed to be like a protection bulwark against the attacks of the Persians. And of course, that means that when they lose the battle and the rest of the city is destroyed, it ends up being abandoned. But the synagogue that's in that sort of pinkish area that you can see, it ends up being protected from the elements and especially from light. And so when it was discovered in the 20th century and excavated in 1932, they discovered these amazing, gorgeous wall paintings. Here's the interior of the synagogue. You can see on the center left is the Aron, where the Torah would have been kept. And all around it are several registers high of various wall paintings. Now, these paintings are absolutely gorgeous. Their color, their density, their artwork. Here's a depiction of the prophet Samuel anointing David with all of his brothers there. 3 of them at least are saying, "Hey, how you doing?" Just so evocative and such a great example of Byzantine art. Here is an example. It looks like you've got, once again, a depiction of the temple below, but above it you have Moses, and it appears it's the same figure, Moses left and right, portrayed twice, which is a convention you sometimes see in ancient art. On the right, he's like drowning the Egyptians with his staff stretched out over the sea, and they're victorious. And on the left, he's leading the Jews off to the land of Israel. It appears like the hands of God. Once again, strange for iconic Jews, but the hands of God are reaching down. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say when this all happened. The Dura Europos synagogue, we know that it was destroyed in the middle of the 3rd century. So all of this art dates from somewhere in the 250s, perhaps. Here is a really dramatic representation of the incident of the golden calf, right? Very, very vivid colors and lots of like action, and of course the flames bursting out with the calf in the middle there. Here's one of my favorites, and quite timely because I'm recording this in the last days of the month of Shvat, and next month is going to be the month of Adar when we celebrate Purim. Here's a beautiful representation of the events of the book of Esther. On the right, you can see Esther there seated on a throne next to King Ahasuerus, who is receiving a letter, a very typical kind of thing for that particular book. And on the left, you see a great scene of Haman leading Mordecai in honor on a white horse. And this was like one of the major turning points in the remarkable book of Esther. Haman is going to be incensed because he feels this honor is something he should receive, and instead he has to, facilitate it for Mordecai. And what's worse, someone stole his pants. So look, he has to walk around in this half tunic all day. I'm just making that part up, but I think it looks pretty funny. At any rate, gorgeous representation. We're so fortunate to have this preserved in the historical record. Okay, let's stop here. Thank you very much for watching. Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. Let's continue our discussion of the early Dark Ages, the development of the diaspora in the 1st century in particular. You see there are Jews living all over what would be today Turkey, and of course in Byzantium. You can see that little spot where the Black Sea meets the Aegean. That's the Byzantium, later Constantinople. And then if you move through the 3rd century, you've got Jews not only, of course, living in Mesopotamia, which is an old Jewish community, but you've got them, occupying sites across the coast of North Africa,
Yo, baby, I'm so
into the
sexy.
Iberian
I'm
Peninsula,
different.
all the way up into Europe as far as London even. And of course, Rome, the Italian peninsula, has a lot of Jews in it, as does the Greek peninsula. Now, it's a little bit misleading because all of these squares indicating Jewish communities are the same size. So you get the sense that, wow, like, look, there's all these Jews in Saragossa and in Bordeaux and things like that. But these could be really tiny settlements. I mean, there might be 3 families, 10 families. It's really hard to say what the size of it is. But nevertheless, you do get a sense of the great scope of Jewish settlement. There are also, with these really, bold starbursts, there are a few communities that also have a strong Christian community as well. Jewish and Christian communities are frequently overlapping for the first couple centuries. In fact, when St. Paul of Tarsus, or Saul of Tarsus, would make his great tours of the Mediterranean, he would frequently go to Jewish sites because that's where he would most likely find likely converts to Christianity.